Excellent. Welcome to the second day of the Blockchain Select Committee. We're hoping to get through the agenda today expeditiously so everybody can get on the road. And that was not one of my keywords, expeditiously. It was just a coincidence that I said it, Cyrus Western. Get everybody back on the road so that if you're planning on traveling tonight, you can do so. We've got a good agenda today to hear from the University of Wyoming on some updates and then work on our decentralized autonomous organization, legislation work, and focus after lunch on digital identity. Co-chairman and I are hoping to try and find a way to break a little early for lunch, get done ahead of lunch, then it takes a little longer than an hour usually to have lunch and based on where we're at. But try and get back and start up right at 1 o'clock so we can hopefully be done by 3-ish o'clock. We'll see if we can set that as a target for today. All right, excellent. With that, any other opening statements or any housekeeping that we need to go over today, Mr. Co-Chairman? No?
No, Mr. Co-Chairman, I don't think I have anything. Just I guess yesterday was I would say yesterday was a pretty good day for the committee. And I guess I'll just reiterate how good it is to be back in person, even though it is in Teton County. But, being in person and seeing live faces here in the room I was counting back and it's been 18 months.
Oh my God.
Since I did that. So really enjoying it. And again, appreciate those who show up to testify in person. It shows a commitment to Wyoming and to the work that we're doing. So really appreciate that.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chairman. I concur. It's wonderful to be back with humans again. We appreciate the hospitality of Teton County School District number 1 for hosting this with excellent facilities that allow us to stream this and record the testimony as well as all the proceedings over the couple of days. So thanks to our hosts and committee. A rebuke from Representative Yen at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the kind words about Teton County. From my co-chairman, I will remember all the jokes when we are in person in Cheyenne. That's all.
Right. A lot of people frequently do, leave here and then go to Cheyenne for the scenery. Pretty common. All right. Any further comments from the committee before we get started? All right. Let's take roll.
Senator
Here.
Senator Cost.
Here.
Senator Nethercott.
Excuse should be here in a minute.
Representative Stith.
Here.
Representative Western. Representative Yin. Mr. Kaufman.
Excused.
And he'll join us. I know he's got some work this morning, but he better be here by the Dows, that's for sure.
He will. He did send me a message on that. So.
Okay, good.
Ms. Long. Here. Mr. Revel.
Excused.
Co-chairman Rothfuss.
Here.
Co-chairman Olson.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, let's get started with an update and report from the University of Wyoming. Please, we've got Professors Caldwell and Gamboa on the Zoom available. And we've got Director Lupien. I see Vice President Mai over there, welcome. And there, okay, I couldn't see Professor Farkas. He turns out he's right behind you and therefore he was invisible for me. So welcome everyone, and feel free to join in, Steve and Bill, if you have anything to add, but we'll get started at this point with Director Lupien. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee. I just want to start with, since first time that we've been live in quite a while, just to very briefly kind of refresh what the mission of the Center for Blockchain and Digital Innovation is at the university, and also to thank this committee and the legislature, because in great part that the center would not exist if it wasn't for the support that the legislature has given the university. So I want to certainly extend my thanks as well. The mission of the center and the Wobble Center, which we'll be talking about with Professor Gamboa and Professor Caldwell, is to provide students and faculty and business professionals and our state government agencies with some distinctive educational opportunities around the blockchain space. We also want to create a research hub around digital assets and blockchain at the university, and also to work with key stakeholders to kind of to facilitate diversifying our economy around this space, which is, frankly, I think the real benefit that Wyoming derives from the work that you've done. And certainly, equally as importantly, is for the university to utilize this technology and partnerships to develop some independent sources of revenue for the university. And in all four of those key objectives, I'm pleased to report that we're actually doing quite well. And I want to walk you some of those, and certainly I want to start with students because students are what we're all about. And probably the biggest news since we've last met is we did get a blockchain minor approved at the university. So we now have an interdisciplinary minor student from the College of Business, the College of Engineering, College of Ag, and School of Energy Resources are participating in this minor, and that minor program begins this fall. So I'm very pleased about that. Also, the classes that we've created around block fundamentals 1 class, fundamentals 2, Dr. Tin is doing kind of a capstone type project course. And each of those courses now we're seeing full enrollment. So we're getting the word out on campus, and students are being responsive to the programs. So we're very happy with that. And we're going to continue working with the academic units around creating some graduate programs. We want to create some certificate programs. So we're continuing to do work on that front. Also, I'm really pleased that the business community has been engaging with our students as well. This past semester, we had 25 students that participated in internships with blockchain companies. And this summer, we have 10 students who have qualified for, it's kind of a stipend and scholarship type program where students are getting $5,000 over the summer to work with blockchain companies, and that's being funded by the center. So again, thanks to each of you for allowing that to happen. Also, we had I think a terrific distinction in there's a worldwide organization called the GBBC, which is a global blockchain business council, and they select a very limited number of students to participate in their global ambassadorship program. And of the 4 students that they've chosen from the US, 2 of them are from the University of Wyoming. So that's pretty, I think, a pretty powerful distinction for our university. So again, so thanks to all of you. Also, our faculty is truly getting engaged in this space as well too. And we have faculty members, and certainly you'll hear from Dr. Gamboa and Dr. Caldwell about the work that they're doing. But in addition, we have a number of faculty members are working on things such as tokenization of carbon credits, which is certainly important to our state. We're working on research around global governance in this space. We've got another professor who is doing research on the impact of CBDCs and how they could impact our economy in the future. And so, we're really starting to get engaged also on that faculty level. So I'm really proud of what's happening in that regard. Yesterday, you had heard from the Wyoming Business Council about some blockchain organizations that are that are coming to Wyoming and working closely with the university. And one of the things I'm personally proud of and has impressed me about my short time in Wyoming is how everyone tends to. They're very collaboratively, and that's certainly been the case with bringing business to Wyoming. The university, the global, the Wyoming Business Council, Cheyenne Leads, the Chamber of Commerce and Laramie all work really well together to help attract some businesses. And Mr. Goldberg mentioned some of them, but I wanted to highlight a couple as well too. A company called VM Excel, domiciled in Wyoming and very quickly has been expanding. Another company, HIPAA Vault, relocated from California to Cheyenne. Herd Dog is a livestock tagging and kind of a blockchain organization that domiciled out of Colorado and Oregon and moved to Laramie. Mr. Goldberg mentioned an exciting company that moved to Wyoming called Elite Mining. They'll be setting up their operations in the next month. Not only do they do Bitcoin mining, but they manufacture Bitcoin mining equipment, very innovative stuff. And they're looking for approximately 50 employees in the Cheyenne area who are, sheet metal benders, welders, but of course there'll be management personnel as well too. And those are great jobs to bring to Cheyenne. So we're pretty proud that the university has had a role in that as well too. And the last thing I'd like to talk about before asking Dr. Gambo and Dr. Caldwell to jump in is the university is working on about 15 or 16 blockchain projects right now. These are projects that either are wholly run and operated by the university or in conjunction with business partners. And those business partners relationships could be that where they're funding us to do this work, or in many cases we are looking at equity positions in some of these companies in return for the work that we're doing. So it'll bring recurring revenue to the university. And just to highlight a couple of the exciting projects, one of them is a project with Net Power, where they're working to develop supercritical CO2 power plants and be able to use that energy, some of the excess energy for crypto mining, but also there's a CO2 sequestration component to that. The university is developing a project called Sheep Chain, where we're going to be developing a ranch management system based on blockchain. And the second component of that is kind of a fun one. Each year, the School of Ag produces these limited edition wool blankets made exclusively with Wyoming wool from a Wyoming mill. And we're going to be tracking those blankets this year on an NFT. So you'll be able to register and have your provenance for your blanket provided that way. So I think that's kind of exciting. We are working with a large ranching partner on developing tokenization of sage grouse credits. We are working on several carbon capture and carbon sequestration projects through the School of Energy Resources. We have been approached by Health and Human Services through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid to work with them to develop a blockchain identity and healthcare delivery system. We are working with a company called Artemis to develop an environmental impact tracking tool that is being mandated through an executive order of the Biden administration. And we've also been asked to work with Cardano on their Cardano 2025 governance project. So there's just an awful lot of activity happening around this space. And thanks to the work of this committee and the legislature, Wyoming is now becoming a destination for companies and organizations that are looking to work more in this space, and they truly do view us as subject matter experts. So with that, I ask my colleagues to chime in.
Thank you, Stephen. And committee, any questions about any of the work or projects we've heard about so far? Do you have additional information on the Net Power project? I actually hadn't heard that we were working with them in this capacity. I visited some of their facilities before. And
yeah, it's a new project that's being started up, and they're looking to develop some power plants on the Wind River reservation, and have approached the university both because of the blockchain component, but also to work through SER. It's in the very early stages, and I'm certainly willing to brief you in the committee as more of that information becomes available.
Yeah, that'd be great. And if following up, if you could link me to some of the details and who's involved in that, I'd appreciate it. I want to hear more about it.
To do that.
Thank you very much. Additional questions? All right. Who should we go to next? And what's the plan of presentation? Any idea? Or should I just pick randomly between Jim and Ruben? All right. Jim, you're on my left. So Jim, Professor Caldwell, welcome. You are muted. The mantra of 2020 and 2021.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman Rothmus and Co-Chairman Olson and the rest of the committee. As Steve just reported, the activity in this past year has just been pretty astounding. We, as you know, the final funding, through IOHK and the matching funding from your legislative funds that have been set aside came through basically at the beginning of the fiscal year on July 1st, but we had started lab activities, as soon as we knew that this was a likely thing back in February. So we had a group together, but of course it's hard when you don't actually have the funding to get going. So we definitely got going in the summer. COVID, I have to say, was quite a setback to us because, you kind of rely on face-to-face interaction for recruiting students, especially, and we didn't really have an opportunity to do that, to express to them our excitement about the project directly. But we managed to we had 3 faculty working on the project in the last year. So I should say that, we started the lab and we named it the Wyoming Advanced Blockchain Research and Development Laboratory. And as I started participating in the IOHK research meetings, the project administrator, they said, "Oh, you mean Wabble?" And I said, "Oh, I love that. We're going to call ourselves Wabble." So we are Wabble. And for the past year, we had 3 UW faculty working on the project. We had 6 graduate students, which included 2 PhD students and 4 master students, one of whom graduated in December. We had various numbers of undergraduate students at various times from 4 to 6 attending our meetings. So we have weekly lab meetings, and all these folks show up. And then we had 4 research projects that we're working on. One of them is related to smart contract development and the smart contract language that IOHK has called Marlowe, and we are very close to we're starting to write a paper about our research there, extending Marlowe programming language. We have a project on developing a cryptographically secure authentication chip. We had a project on kind of hardware side attacks, which is looking at RFID chips, which are the kind of devices that the authentication chip eventually will be, and trying to see about how to attack those. And we're currently looking at, we've instrumented a commonly used RFID chip card used in Europe, especially for a lot of the subway in Paris and so forth. This is called the Tangem card, and we're trying. We're actually making some nice progress on sort of revealing some of the secrets in the card. And then, of course, the kind of the most famous project, maybe to this committee, is the Cardano node project. I will talk about that maybe a little bit more in a few minutes, but I guess I should go back and say that, and since we're ramping up, we've hired a visiting professor to help us on formal verification and theorem proving side for the authentication protocol and chip. And we hired actually, thanks to Steve and Caitlin, knew of a cryptographer, that world-renowned cryptographer, I'd say, or at least recognized cryptographer, Lisa Yin, who we managed to hire. We just brought her on board as a contractor for the next year to work on the authentication project. And so we're very excited to get started working with her. We've had over the year a series of seminars that we are, where we've had speakers. Bradley Retner from philosophy turned out, wrote an article that we saw published. I just saw it published, an article about philosophy of cryptocurrency. He's working with some other philosophers at other universities, and they co-wrote an article, and we called him up and said, hey, come give us a talk about what you're doing. And so we had Brad, and we've had professors from petroleum engineering. We've had we've been trying to get in the fall, I guess we'll resume, Dan Stanescu from math, who is working on, from the math department, who is working on theorem proving. So I should probably just say a word that IOHK, one of the main reasons that I personally, and I think academically, that we saw this as such a great fit, is that IOHK is applying the highest level of scrutiny to the software artifacts that they're building. So they mathematically prove the correctness of the protocol. And what that means is they characterize the protocol, and then a little bit maybe more like if you remember taking geometry in high school, those are mathematical proofs as opposed to sort of solving equations, and you prove properties about the software. And so they're very heavily invested in that, and that is the highest level of scrutiny that you can apply to software. So we are working on developing this summer. Professor Stanescu from math has been teaching for the last few years some students to learn how to use a theorem prover called the Lean theorem prover. And IOHK is actually quite interested in Lean. And this summer, we, out of our lab funds and legislative funds, we're running we're calling it an REU, which is what the NSF calls research experiences for undergraduates. And we have, I think, 8. It just finished. It's just still being formed. It's going to start next week. 8 students who are going to work for 5 weeks initially, and we're paying those students the standard NSF rate per week, which is $500 a week to attend an REU. They set these things up all over the country, and then schools send out advertisements to other schools to get students to apply. And this was Professor Stanescu's first application to NSF, and he got rejected. So we said, we'll fund it out of the lab. And so we have, and we're kind of viewing it as building, seed corn for of students who understand a very sophisticated technology that's just not very commonly seen. We, like Steve said, we're working on so many different projects, and I get one of us, Dr. Mike Brovchek is the co-director of the lab with me. We get email inquiries or phone calls that come to us. Certainly on a weekly basis, and so we do have a lot of visibility at the lab. I guess one thing that I should say is that Mr. Lupian restarted a old program that we used to have with the state. It used to be with the ETS office, and where is that? What I'm going blank on the name. Is it ETS where they develop essentially the IT work for the state? And in that program, which was started by Clint Waters, who used to be the state CIO, we had the FBI and we had the Secretary of State's office and various other people, DHS, participating. And Steve's reconstituted that, and it's a smaller group, which probably works better. We have a couple of representatives from the FBI, and we have a couple from the Secretary of State's office, and then there's Steve and Mike and I. And we're sort of looking at issues that maybe UW could be useful in helping out the Secretary of State's office. And, one area they're concerned about is the registration of DAOs starting on July 1st, because I guess they are, essentially delegated the responsibility of overseeing that process and, taking action if there's any problems. So we are going to start, what we're going to start doing is those DAO applications are all, the code becomes completely public. And so what we're going to start doing is we're going to build a public facing database out of the lab for every DAO that gets registered in the state of Wyoming. And then we're going to be able to start to do kind of some data analytics on those and start to look at those and possibly start to work on, this is enough understanding the correctness of DAO code is currently kind of an unknown area, more or less. And so, we're developing these tools with formal verification. There are mechanisms for verifying, distributed programs. And so we're going to start looking at that and trying to cultivate some students to head in that direction and maybe try to recruit some PhD students to work on that area. We'll have kind of like a huge database, I assume, of DAO code to work with and look at. So that's kind of an exciting, I feel like that's a pretty exciting project. It's got some real technical meat to it, and it's a promising and important research area. And IOHK is looking to our lab to build into a smart contract engineering institute so that we would kind of be the go-to place for information about smart contract development. And so that's good news.
Jim, let me interrupt you there because I have a
Yeah.
question about that, and then we'll pause also and see if anyone has any questions before we continue. On this Dow Engineering Lab concept, tell me about the law school's involvement, and you know, have we started down that road to engaging the law school with the College of Engineering and Applied Sciences to kind of bring that joint expertise together so that our legal minds and our legal students, our law students are contemplating, all right, well, does this make legal sense? And then our coding team says, you know, does it do that? Because to me, wow, what a tremendous idea and value that you've brought with this DAO discussion. That's actually the first I've heard of that effort. So I really appreciate it. And I want to hear more about what you see as the vision of the future on that.
Well, I think certainly the law school will have a role to play. I have personally not have any contact with the law school. I think maybe Mr. Lupian could talk a little bit about maybe how the law school is being pulled in on this. I mean, this literally happened last week, so this is brand new, but it is a project that I mean, we've been having meetings. I don't know, is that our second or our third meeting that we had with this group, and we're going to continue those meetings for on a monthly basis, a month to 6 weeks for their for the foreseeable future. But as far as pulling in the law school, obviously we're going to have to do that. And I think in a recent visit, we heard from Mr. Jim Rao from Enturo to the lab. He expressed interest in kind of creating more than just financial contracts, but legal contracts that could be executed on the blockchain. And so certainly he mentioned a couple of places. We just haven't had a chance to follow up on that in terms of trying to put more of the legal aspect into the contracts instead of primarily the financial aspects. So no, I would say no, I haven't had any contact yet. I would maybe ask Mr. Lupian if he has a comments on that.
Absolutely, Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we've been working primarily with the law school's law practicum, and have been some of the companies that have approached us. You know, we've had some the law practicum. Excuse me. They do participate in helping us. Mostly through the foundation, however, on planning for the upcoming hackathon. We have a day that's dedicated to what we call LawCon. But I do think that we need to make greater efforts within the university to bring the law school in and work more with the administration over at the law school. I think there's a greater opportunity for us to do that, and that's one of the things that I am planning on doing. Even recently, I've had a conversation with Dean Drasco and specifically about this. And after the holiday, we've agreed that we're going to kind of approach the dean of the law school and try to get some more involvement with the law school. I think it's an area that we need more. And I also think it's an area, frankly, that the University of Wyoming can truly those of us that work in the space, one of the challenges is there's simply not enough attorneys out there that really understand this asset class, and you tend to hear the same attorneys over and over again on these deals because of that. And I think there's a terrific opportunity for the University of Wyoming to distinguish itself by developing a strong program in our law school.
Thank you. Committee, on that topic, any questions? We've got obviously a pretty good number of attorneys on this committee, and I think we understand the importance of ensuring that we have sufficient legal understanding and expertise in the state to actually fuel all of these efforts that we're putting forward. And I know anecdotally, and I think everybody here knows anecdotally, that the limited number of knowledgeable attorneys in the state in the space are all pretty much overwhelmed, really, in terms of their workload. They're struggling to keep up. So the more we can do to engage the law school to get the next generation of students trained, as well as what Professor Caldwell's talking about, taking it a step further, not just setting up companies in a knowledgeable way, but being able to engage at the cutting edge of what DAOs are capable of and smart contracts, and leading in that space through the law school in conjunction with the rest of the university's work is tremendous. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yep, Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm just thankful that we're considering those poor attorneys that are overworked. It's not often that attorneys are put in that kind of limelight. It's usually the reverse. So I really appreciate that.
Well, absolutely. And I have it on good authority from my dear friend at the end of the table that there is a tremendous burgeoning crisis of all attorneys in the state of Wyoming. If the good senator wants to comment on that.
I do not. I believe that the committee has done a wonderful job of outlining that the critical need for lawyers. The only disagreement I have is that there are not enough on this committee.
There's always an aspiration point of unanimity. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Professor Caldwell, I wanted to ask generally about the role that intellectual property plays in the work that you and your group do. Is your focus mostly on academic production, and so what you produce is just open to the public and you're not asserting a copyright or a patent in what you're creating? Or is there a component of this that is subject to copyright or patent protection?
Go ahead, Professor Caldwell.
That's a great question, and a rather interesting one, I think, from the point of our collaboration with IOG or IOHK, is that they do all of everything they do in the company is essentially open source, whether it's hardware or software. They use different licenses depending on which kind of artifact is being constructed, but all the work that we've been doing with them is through open source. And I have to say that was a interesting concept for the lawyers who do the IP for UW. But the argument that I made essentially was, well, we do open source work when we're funded by NSF or any other federal agency, and IOHK is not taking the IP for themselves. So UW should be willing to go along with the open source. And so that's what our agreement is with them. Now, if we, for example, get the authentication chip constructed, there are some licensing rights that you can get. So like, for example, the Raspberry Pi chip is a licensed project, even though it's open and free for anyone to build. The licensing, there are some licensing fees that go along with that. And so that could certainly be, like play an important role in the universities, in possibly an income, but also certainly in like an international reputation for the university as being the developer of that chip.
Thanks, Professor Caldwell. Go ahead, Stephen.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Yeah.
can add some more to
Please
that, through the chair. Representative, the project we are working on, could have intellectual property, especially the ones that we're working with private companies. And we are working, the center is working closely with our Office of Research and Economic Development on projects like Sheep Chain that I mentioned earlier. University of Wyoming owns that trademark. So we are getting involved in things such as that. I do see tech transfer and intellectual property becoming an increasingly important part. I do know that that is and I'm certainly not speaking for President Seidel, but in the conversations I've had with him, he does view intellectual property and tech transfer as a potential for future income for the university, and it's typically done through us protecting intellectual property either on our own or some of the projects that we're working on in conjunction with business partners. There are agreements in place where that may not be open source software.
Follow up, Representative, anything?
No.
Good. Okay. Further questions? Go ahead, Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, just to switch gears a little bit, a question regarding Dr. Yin. Have we just now formally announced that? And can you share a little bit of information about Dr. Yin? You may want to look her up on her Wikipedia page, by the way. She's very
Right.
famous.
All right,
Yeah.
go ahead, Professor Caldwell.
Well, yeah, it took quite a while to complete the negotiation on that, partially because of her her fee was kind of exceptionally high. And so we ended up going back to IOHK, and when we did, it said, look, we want to hire this cryptographer to work on this project. And then they were, oh, we want to hire this cryptographer. And so they talked to her, but she's not interested in a permanent position right now. And so they augmented our funding by $90,000 to help to be able to essentially pay from IOHK so that it wasn't coming out of all of our contract. She's, she's a very well-known cryptographer, I guess primarily from breaking, a very fast but widely used at the time hash function, the SHA-1 hash function, and showing insecurities in that. And we've had numerous meetings with her, and everything seems to be, seems like we're going to be able to work together very well as a group.
Excellent. Any follow-up, Ms. Long?
Is this public? Can we talk about this?
Sure,
Or
why
is the
not?
university
I'm
announced
talking,
It's
yes.
public now.
No, yeah. All
Okay, yeah,
contracts,
this is
everything's
still
in
for Wyoming.
place. Yeah,
All right.
everything is,
Okay.
she's
And
on board now.
follow up, Mr.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. How many is she in a permanent or temporary role with the university?
Temporary.
It's
I
temporary. Okay.
think that we have her for, essentially we have her for 33, for a third of her time throughout the year.
Wonderful.
Professor Caldwell, did the university hire her as a visiting professor? Is that the arrangement, or what would her title be?
She's a contract employee.
Okay.
It's easier. That's the way that it's the easy. Believe me, you want to go the
No,
easiest.
I
way.
understand. Yeah, understood. Thank you.
Mr.
Any
Chairman,
follow-up? Go ahead, Ms. Long.
just to underscore, she has a MIT cryptography PhD, and Google, when they broke the SHA-1 hash function in 2016, gave her credit because she wrote the paper in 2005 describing how it would someday be done. And then once Google actually brute force broke it, and SHA-1 was at the time the cryptography that underscored most websites, and she broke that. And obviously since then it's all been upgraded. Well, in theory, it's all been upgraded, but and I had the privilege of working with her at Symbiont, a previous startup where I was. So wonderful that the university was able to close that. She's a big deal.
Thank you. Thanks for the commentary. Any further comments on that topic, Professor?
I might
Stephen?
just add,
ahead.
if I might, that her group at the cryptography group at MIT that she comes out of is, without a doubt, the best in the world. They invented so many of the concepts that we're using, that we hear about in blockchain now, that 20 years ago when they were first invented were extremely obscure theoretical concepts in computer science. Zero knowledge proofs were just an astounding development in theoretical computer science 20, 25 years ago. And now, you've got kids walking down the street in Dubai talking about zero knowledge proofs. It's astounding.
Thank you, Professor. Anything else on these topics before we let Professor Caldwell continue? All right, go ahead, Professor Caldwell.
Okay, I guess I don't have all that much more to say, except that I can talk more about our node project, our Cardano stake pool node that we implemented and how that's going. And I'll just say that, for us doing research on Cardano, it was important for us to be able to have a node, as new releases of the blockchain come out, we will we update the node. We get to see what the new features are. We get to also observe the behavior of the network. So it's really from an educational and research perspective that we initiated the setting up the node. And, with in a joint project with Philip Trike's finance class, which has real money, not play money, to invest, that's held by the foundation, we were able to get that node started with $50,000 of funds that were transferred into ADA and then put into our node. We wrote 2 documents to the foundation to sort of justify that investment on their part, although they still own the ADA. So one was kind of a justification and a description of the difference between, proof of work and proof of stake, and a general overview of how stake pools work and how ours would work. And then we also wrote a technical security document that described the security mechanisms that we used on AWS when we implemented it to try to, make it as, I think it's about as secure a AWS implementation as you can have. Is from what I understand. That's not my area of expertise, but Dr. Brofchek and so one of our PhD students, Finley McElwain, was the one that mainly took that project on and implemented it with some help from another PhD student in the cybersecurity lab, Cedar, Mason Johnson. So the 2 of them are the ones that we're looking to for, and they're very excited about this future project that the legislature has set the funds aside for. I mean, Dr. Brofchek and I will certainly be involved, but they'll be doing the primary implementation, and we're very lucky to have them. They could be making a lot more than I do if they were out in industry with the skills that they have. So, but they're committed to PhDs, which is, a really noble thing. So I'd like to kind of, I just want to put their names out there to thank them and express our gratitude for, having smart Wyoming students who are involved in this research. Since the node started going, so far this morning I looked, it looks like we've minted 62 blocks. We've had 46 delegators. So, and one of those delegators has made a huge difference, and that was the Cardano Foundation, but they kind of randomly select, I don't know the criteria that they use for selecting stake pools to drop in a large 15 million ADA have been added, have been staked with our pool. So that's part of our active stake. And that will go away though after 3 months. And, so then we're back before that stake came in. We were up about between $2 and $3 million. It fluctuates because people, delegate and then they switch their delegation to someplace else. So we will drop back down. But while we're up there, we're minting blocks like mad. So we've had 62 blocks so far. I have to say the first block that we minted was really unlikely that we would. There's a number of different parameters. It's a complex formula actually used to determine the distributed process for selecting the next stake pool that will mint a block. And one of those parameters is luck. And we happen to have some good luck early on and got our first block. So that's great. And since then, well, I see some smiles around the table. So here is an interesting thing that they just recently did on the Cardano blockchain. Was they implemented a mechanism based on 2 inputs where at a certain time, and so this was to inject entropy into the system to make that luck parameter truly random. And what they did was they went to there's I think 6 or 10 different seismic data sites around the world, and eventually they all agree. And then they also went to the New York Times publication of stock values at a certain time on a certain day and read those values out of a PDF. And then stake pool operators throughout the network took, if they were, you had to be like a pretty sophisticated user, but those values were boiled down into, a truly random number. So you might have been able to use a quantum computer to compute that, but this is a really very interesting experiment to find a regular way of injecting randomness into the system partially for that luck parameter. So I don't know. I guess I'd be open to questions on how on the node. How it looks like. I think, I should mention one more thing, which is that we looked like, we calculated roughly when we do, you never know exactly, and not taking into account the fluctuations in the price of ADA, it looks like we will make about 50,000 ADA over the year operating the stake pool. This is based on numbers, though, calculated during this period where we had the 15 million. So those funds will be used to go back into the lab and to actually provide excellent funds in the computer science department to send students to international and national academic conferences, which we've found to be, one of the most, it can be a kind of a major moment in a student's life to go and sort of participate in a professional conference in an area in computer science where they're interested. And so we're looking forward to having extra funds to be able to do that. So
Excellent.
I guess
Thanks,
at that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions, Representative Western and then Representative Stiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Senator Chairman Rothfuss, I appreciate you sending along that link to kind of describing it. It says live stake 15.89M with an A with 2 slashes.
Ada.
What does that mean?
Those are ADA, which I don't know the current price. I mean, it's been around $1.75. But what does it mean? It means, it does not mean that we have, I guess the first thing is that it doesn't mean that we have 15.89 million ADA. It means that that the Cardano Foundation pledged 15 million ADA. And so that ADA, when you pledge ADA, you retain the ADA in whatever wallet you have. So you still own the ADA. It's just like sort of, in a way, I mean, I don't know. The way I like to think of it is if you had all that ADA and I told you, oh, you could go and pledge it with a stake pool and make up to, let's say 5 to 6% interest on your ADA, would you do it? And you still hold your ADA. All you have to do is designate the stake pool. So they've designated our stake pool for 15 million in ADA, but they have that in a number of different stake pools, have that Cardano delegation. And so if you take away the 15, we've got, 0.89, which is a little disappointing. If you look down, I think if you're looking at the ADA pools, you'll see that the pool size, we were up. We were close to 2 million before we got the I think it was, what was it? It was like 1.857 million ADA at the point when the 15 million was dropped in, but it'll go away after 3 months.
Representative Western, follow up. Any more questions about how this works?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what's the difference between a live stake and an active stake? See, there's some
Well,
discrepancy there.
Go ahead, Jim.
At various times, people delegate and people can pull their delegation at any time. They can say, oh, I don't want to use that stake pool and switch it to a different stake pool. Now, when you switch to a new stake pool, there's a 3-week window before, or I'm sorry, 3 epoch window, and an epoch is 5 days. And so that's kind of the unit of time on the Cardano blockchain. So when you move your stake, you have to wait 15 days before you kind of start seeing the funds. So the fact that there is, I don't know, what did you say? I missed the numbers. But oh yeah. So the active stake is what's currently pledged, and the live stake is, or what is going to be pledged. The live stake is what we currently have going. And so some people have removed, but they're still, it hasn't taken effect yet.
Go ahead, Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now let's go over to the right-hand part of that column. And it says block trend. And it says the number 12. What does that mean?
I guess I think it's the expected number of blocks that we will mint. And so if you look at the graph down below, I think that block trend value is shown in that graph. I'm having trouble getting my windows sorted here so I can look, but you can sort of see that where we are at now, our delegators is going up. That's good. There's the pool size. I think, well, maybe if you go actually to the tab blocks, you see there's a performance tab down in the section below. And then if you go to the blocks tab, you can see that the number has gone way up, and we had at one point 10 blocks that we minted in the last epoch, and that were, on, what day was that? The 26th of May, 2 days ago. And we had 5 the day before that, and we have 1 so far today, but that number can go up. So that's essentially the estimated number based on the formula that's used to select stake pools to mint blocks. So it's estimated that we'll have 12 blocks in this epoch. But it's largely a function of the fact that we have $15 million in stake currently.
15 million ADA.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, not dollars, ADA.
Further questions? Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Below the active stake, it says pledge, and then it says about 45,000 ADA.
Yes.
I thought the live stake was the amount that's actively been pledged into the pool. No?
Go ahead, Jim.
That is the initial funds that were put into the start our pool. Those are funds that are owned by the UW Foundation. So you have pledge and you have stake. And I don't know, I probably mix up all the terms all the time. I may have said pledge when I meant delegation. So the terminology is that if you owned ADA in your wallet and you wanted to stake with our stake pool, you delegate ADA to our stake pool. The pledge is the initial starting amount that you need. You need something to start. And the amount, the block trend, or the number of blocks that you get is a function of the pledge, the active stake, your luck, various other factors that are in that equation that occasionally are changed to get the, behavior of the overall network to be more what they want. So there was a factor that was like how much of the stake was run by IOHK. That's gone to 0 now. Now the stake pool operators are running the entire network. There's also a maximum size of any stake pool is, I think, 62 million right now. And that's to avoid monopolies. Like you could have multiple stake pool operators coming together and saying, okay, let's build a one stake pool that will get all. So part of the goal is to just, each time we're minting blocks, we're adding on the blockchain. And part of the goal of kind of the behavior of the network is to keep it widely distributed and to not have any, monopolies, because that would mean that you've got somebody who could, essentially have control of the blockchain.
Any other questions? Appreciate the discussion on that. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Professor Caldwell, thank you. So does the $4 million that the legislature has appropriated to the university for the stake pool, how will that help give the pool a competitive edge, if at all? And will that change on our screen here where we see how much is pledged? Will that number change that pledge number? And as a related question, how does any given stake gain a competitive edge over another?
Go ahead, Mr. Caldwell.
So the project that was recently, funds were allocated by the legislature, we're viewing that as, this is our research node, and we're viewing that as a separate project. And according to that funding note, we're going to run 3 different stake pools. For 3 different, at minimum of 3 different cryptocurrencies will be chosen for stake pools. And so that project is different from this one, but suppose that we said, oh, it's not, and you just wanted to stake the 4 million, the state wanted to stake 4 million in our stake pool, then that would raise the active pledge up by 4 million. And so the primary factors in selecting who gets the next block is your stake, and your stake is a function of how much the initial pledge was. So the bigger your initial pledge is, kind of the more likely that plays a role in whether or not you're awarded the chance to mint the next block, and then also the active stake. And so really this is viewed as, and we have not taken efforts to market our stake pool, although maybe this is a chance to market it. And if anyone wants to pledge ADA to our stake pool, the ticket is UWYO. But you know, it would add 4 million. And so you need to be essentially above about 1.5 million right now, ADA, to be sort of guaranteed to get at least one block every 5 days, which is an epoch. And if you get that, you get something more than just the funds that are accrued in the kind of paid back in interest. You also get 340 ADA paid back to the stake pool itself for operating the stake pool. And our stake pool is running on AWS, and so those fees are, you know, useful to us. I cannot remember what our monthly bill is. It's not so high. It's not very high for running this operation, actually, because it's not like mining, right? In a mining operation, you're doing a lot of computing. This thing is sitting there, and then you get a message, okay, mint a block, and then you look and you go and you mint it, and then you send out some messages. It's a very low overhead, computational overhead on running the stake pool. Did I answer your question?
Follow-up, Representative Stiff?
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Excellent, thanks. Joel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Caldwell, do you have a sense for roughly the yield that your project is earning over the pledged amount?
We are taking 1%. I think it's published there on the ADA pools. Now, that's a factor, and we're really going to be depending on Phil Trike's finance class in the fall to try to figure out how do you optimize the parameters that we have control on setting. I mean, you don't have so much control over our pledge, but you know, that will be a factor maybe in the stake pool that we set up if we choose ADA for one of the state funded stake pools. But we're trying to optimize that based on pledge. But like, what's the right trade-off there? And then also some stake pools collect higher margin and some collect zero in an attempt to attract more pledge, so delegation, I mean. So it's an interesting trade-off. But right now we're at 1%.
Go ahead, Joel.
Thank you. Just a couple more, if I may, please, Mr. Chairman. So essentially by staking these assets, your reward is approximately 1% on the assets. Is that correct?
Professor?
Our reward on is approximately 1% on the active stake. Not just the 45,000 ADA that were put in by the, so we get, if you think of it, maybe, I don't know, I'm not a finance guy, but I think of it this way. If you think of it as like 5% per year, right? Then roughly 1% of that 5% is coming back as overhead to the university, to our stake pool. And then we also, though, get 340 ADA per epoch where we mint a block. So one strategy could be to have many, many stake pools that are funded to a rate where you just at least get to mint one block an epoch, and you could make some, some decent income that way. But you need 1.2 million, roughly, or between 1 and 2 million ADA to be able to mint a block. So you'd have to have a considerable amount of either external stake or pledge. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Go ahead, Joel.
Maybe not. It could be I'm not understanding, Professor Caldwell. I'm sorry, but perhaps
the yield on the full stake is 5%. So if there's $15 million that's staked, the annual yield based on our existing performance is 4.978%. At 5% is about where you would expect. ADA predicts between 4 and 6% annual yield. And so we're actually right in the center of the predicted range.
Mm-hmm.
So that's for the entire stake. We receive the full amount for our pledge portion of it. So we get a 5% yield on our 45,600 ADA. If we have the legislative appropriation and matched gift, then, which would total $12 million, that you can imagine if it were all staked in ADA, which again is not consistent with the legislation, but if it were, it would be a 5% yield on the 12 million, which would be a value of $600,000 in ADA as our portion of it. For operating the staking node, we then have the 1% margin, which is something that we choose to set. You can set what that is, but that's a competitive marketplace where you choose your set. So we then receive additional revenue from our operating the node. And then there's the fixed cost of the 340 ADA that per epoch that we bill out, so to speak, that's available, as Professor Caldwell said, particularly if we end up running a consistent pool, then you get that bonus continual operation reward, which is built into the blockchain's operation. So that's the path where if we are invested, we get the primary. As the operator of the node, we get this secondary margin, and then we get fixed cost. Go ahead, Joel.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I'm wondering sort of a bigger question that ties to a brief discussion yesterday and that we're going to discuss in the next committee meeting around the ability to stimulate either through legislation or through economic development, private sector mining, either proof of work or proof of stake mining in these sort of stranded renewables or flared gas type resources in Wyoming. Is there a role for a public-private partnership here with the university?
Go ahead, Mr. Lupien.
Well, we are in the process of doing that. I referred to, for example, the Net Power project with SER and some other projects that we're starting with. Absolutely, I think there's an opportunity for the university to participate in public-private partnerships around those types of projects.
Is there anything our committee can be doing to help in that regard?
Go ahead, Mr. Lupien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this stage, I'm not aware of anything specifically. However, we will certainly, when that need arises, we'll certainly, come to this committee and ask for that. Right now, we're so early stage that I don't think I'm in a position to be able to give you anything credible or meaningful in that.
And on that topic, and you brought this to our attention to something we should take a look at. We'll have this on our second meeting agenda. So I'd ask you, Mr. Lupien, and others to really give this some thought over the next couple of months and figure out what we can be doing and what barriers are in place, what we're hearing from industry as statutory challenges, and any way that we could have a public-private partnership to encourage this. And that's something then that we'll take up at our next meeting and hopefully be able to act on if there are any challenges that we hear of. And I've heard of some challenges, just Office of State Lands, for example, contemplating how do we have a royalty or something associated with it if mining is going on with flared gas. There actually are some little nuanced statutory challenges about how to handle this that aren't well clarified. So I think we do have, if nothing else, that conversation to have.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, there is a surprising number of extremely creative projects that are coming to the university, including, a company we've just started working with that is using solar energy to, crack liquid hydrogen. And one of the byproducts is so much heat that they want to set up a mining operation. So there's the creativity that's happening in this space. In fact, certainly I don't want to, step on anything Elon Musk may have said, but in fact, there's a lot of data now that this asset class is actually driving more renewables because of projects exactly like what you're talking about. And there's a recent Cambridge University study which is basically not only states how much renewable energy is being used, but mining in particular is making a lot of these renewable projects profitable, and in fact is driving more and more renewable. And I don't think that's being discussed much in the media, but we at the university are looking at that quite extensively.
Follow up?
I just would make a comment that it strikes me as an interesting alignment of attributes that we have here in Wyoming. Of one, we have a surplus sovereign fund here in the state. Number two, we have a unique set of energy resources, both stranded renewables, flared gas, et cetera, that are unutilized and will probably go unutilized until the transmission issues are solved. And then we have this sort of mining DNA in the state. And now we have this digital asset DNA forming in the state. And it just seems to me that there's a very interesting intersection at all of those that we should perhaps think more about.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good point. Thank you so much. Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And maybe just back to the previous point about the 1% fee. So the 1%, just to reframe it for the committee, it's 1% based on the amount staked, which isn't all of our money, as the good chairman noted. So it's essentially a management fee for the amount that the foundation and us and other people who have joined the pool have put in. So the foundation gets a return when we get a 1% on top of what they receive. And the question ultimately that I have for you, Director Lupien, maybe you, Dr. Caldwell, is where in the hypothetical timeline are we with the $4 million budget, and are there thoughts on where we want to go with it?
Go ahead, Mr. Lupien.
Mr. Chairman, certainly I don't want to announce anything, but we've had a number of organizations approach us as a result of the meeting gotten about the Section 340. And in fact, we are speaking with a notable alumni right now about that. I don't want to go into more, but I think an announcement could hopefully, details to be worked out. But I'm impressed by how quickly we got responses around that. You know, we've been working closely with Senator Rothfuss on that. And, you know, all I can say is, you know, hopefully we'll be able to announce something in the future, but certainly it's not my place right now. That would come from the president's office.
And a couple more things as far as progress on that. There are 3 gubernatorial appointees on the Crypto Advisory Council that will kind of oversee the proposal in collaboration with the universities that gets put together for kind of approval then on the release of the funds. And the governor has an incredible list of names. I believe he's made one formal, although not yet announced, appointment, and the list of the list of others that he's considering for the other 2, I think, are exceptional. And hopefully it's possible he's already gotten that finished, but I don't have word on that yet. But he was trying to finish it up last week, and hopefully that's the case. So we should see those announcements pretty soon of who that Crypto Advisory Council is. Professor Caldwell is the university appointee. Co-chairman Olson and I are appointees, and then Chief Investment Officer for the state, Patrick Fleming, and rounds out the council. So it's a good group that will then take a look really at the questions that we have. All right, what would be an appropriate strategy for developing these pools? You know, I wish we already had the answers that Professor Caldwell was talking about and Mr. Lupien was talking about in terms of how do we predict what the best approach to optimizing yield on staking nodes would be. But there are a multitude of high market capital staked cryptocurrencies available to choose from. And then there are other emerging cryptocurrencies and technologies that we can contemplate. And the discussion has always focused on not just optimizing the yield and dollar value, but simultaneously focusing on the educational opportunities, the value to the university in terms of building partnerships and outreach, and making it a cohesive project that can be built from, as opposed to just figuring out what's the highest yield we can get next week. Very much larger than that, and part of the efforts that President Seidel has been discussing in extending a College of Computing or a Center of Computing, and working with the university faculty throughout the university, not just within the College of Engineering, on broadening this vision. So it's been great discussion, honestly. I think there's been a lot of good things happening. But I really do wish we already had the money and were able to buy a tremendous amount of crypto in this last dip, because I feel like we would have more than paid back everything if we'd have just had it about 5 days ago, maybe 7 days ago, whatever that was. But we are where we are, and it's great progress, and appreciate all the work on that. Any further questions, Representative Bien? Follow up on that? All right. Further questions before we go back? Professor Caldwell, anything else that you've got for us? And then I'll go to Professor Gamboa.
Mr. Kaufman has a question.
Oh, I see. My apologies. Mr. Kaufman, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies again to my co-committee members here. I'm managing some multiple obligations today, so I apologize for jumping in and out. But I just had a quick question, Mr. Chairman, maybe for you or Mr. Lupien, anybody, because I'm just not familiar. Who right now is sort of the decision makers with respect to this group? Is it ultimately going to be the council that's put in place? And the main reason I ask that is I'm getting questions from all kinds of parties about, who are we going to? Who are the people that are ultimately going to be making decisions about partnerships, where this money goes? And so I've reviewed the legislation, but there's not a lot of color in there about how the structure of this entity is going to work. I wondered if someone might speak to that.
Yeah, I'll start, and hopefully others can add if I have any gaps. But the way it's lined out, it's the university is leading on the project, and the foundation has already been working with the university in terms of coordinating the original staking pool. And so we've got a relationship there that can be modeled as far as kind of the internal operation of where these staking pools exist on the books, so to speak. And this project then is going to be overseen by the university, but at the same time, in the budget footnote, we have the language that indicates that the decisions will all be sort of overseen and approved by this crypto advisory council, which I don't anticipate to be meeting frequently. I think it'll be, review these documents and this proposal over, and then maybe chat on Zoom is probably the approach that entity will have to make sure that there's agreement that it's an appropriate path. And then the original proposal, which will act as sort of the guidance for the project, would be approved first by that advisory council as a recommendation to the governor, and then the governor would sign off. But as written, it's a university project with this council as an oversight entity, just to check and make sure that some field experts that we're bringing in through the gubernatorial appointments agree that the decisions that are being made are sound, which is what I would expect anyway. So I hope that helps to clarify, and I'd be happy to hear from Mr. Lupien or any others if there's anything that should be added to that discussion.
No, Mr. Chairman, that's my understanding as well.
Great. Mr. Kaufman, and does that help?
Yes, Mr.
And if
Chairman, it does.
And if you have anyone that's interested in participating or wants to get involved, I would ask that you have them contact Mr. Lupien as the point of contact on that. Great.
Mr. Chairman,
Yep, go ahead.
Mr. Allen has raised his hand.
All right. Excellent. Well, I need to get to Mr. Or Professor Gamboa and see if he has any comments first. And then I think we'll get to public comment. So Professor Gamboa, anything to add, any projects that you want to highlight before we get to public comment?
Let's see. Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm sorry I'm not joining you guys in person. I was selfishly looking forward to visiting Teton County. The schedule just didn't work out. Right after this, I have another obligation. In fact, for the next 2.5 weeks, I'm going to be grading something like 140,000 AP exams. So that's a big issue. Anyway,
Congratulations.
This session, yeah, thank you. You're hearing from 3 groups at UW that are associated with blockchain. There's the research lab WABL, the Center for Blockchain Digital Innovation, and now the Department of Computer Science. And as the head of that department, I will limit my comments just to that, just to what we're doing here in the department, and not in those other areas. Now, as a professional, professor, I usually speak in 50-minute intervals, but I did hear your call for an early lunch, so I'll try to limit my comments in time as well as department. So in the department, our primary mission as far as blockchain is concerned is educational. I say that, and I should point out that the department is actually engaged in research in the blockchain space, but that's primarily in the WABL lab, and you already heard from Dr. Caldwell about those exciting efforts, so I'm not going to double on that. On the teaching side, we are currently supporting the minor in blockchain, which is actually administered by the center. We have introductory courses on the books that are related to blockchain, and we plan to expand our blockchain portfolio to include more specialized courses. One positive thing I want to share with you is that these courses have been very popular. Recently, I actually had a high school student that I've been working with ask me if they could sign up for the blockchain intro course. As Mr. Lupien said earlier, those courses fill up quite quickly, so I have to say no, it's just not right. But that shows you there's a great deal of interest even in future students. Now, I want to emphasize that blockchain technology is well within the scope of what I'll call traditional computer science. That means, for instance, that there's no need for a new 4-year degree for blockchain, kind of the same way that we don't have separate degrees for, say, database science or mobile programming. That goes for 4-year degrees. Certificates and minors are a different story. And like I mentioned, we're currently collaborating on a minor and planning a certificate. Other universities, including a big one about 100 miles south of Laramie, have come to the same conclusion. The thing is, blockchain is a specialized area of computer science that combines a lot of traditional computer science topics in a novel way. And in so doing, it actually creates significant value and opportunities. It does bring in some new challenges, mostly related to the immutability of data, including smart contracts. So writing smart contracts is considerably more difficult than writing, normal programs. That means that blockchain programming is an advanced topic in computer science, and to get there requires significant preparation in other more traditional computer science topics, as well as some kind of non-traditional computer science topics. And you heard from Dr. Caldwell, for example, about formal verification that has a role to play here as well. Now, when you view this whole thing from this lens, then our department's support for blockchain technologies is even larger than may first appear. For instance, not every course that is essential for building blockchain skills has blockchain in the title, right? So you can't just look at the catalog and go, oh, yeah, that's where they support blockchain. That also explains why certificates and minors work very well for us, because, like I said, for other universities as well, because they feature specialized coursework, right? Here's a blockchain sequence that you should take, but that's in the context of larger preparation that actually gets you ready to tackle that material. Now, again, that goes for four-year degrees. When it comes to advanced degrees, there's always a room for specialization. And I always think of the way that many universities offer graduate degrees, but not a single undergraduate degree in, say, astronautical engineering. There's enough in common between that and mechanical engineer that students can actually major in mechanical for their bachelor's and then specialize in aeroastro for their master's or PhD. So that's kind of the way that I see blockchain kind of working out. Now, another way in which the department is supporting blockchain is with a pilot project to develop some useful blockchain applications. And for example, you can have a team made up of students, faculty, even an administrator, like a head, collaborate to build blockchain applications. And you already heard from Mr. Lupin about some of these applications. This fits in very well with our educational goals and also with our outreach and now entrepreneurial interests. So I don't have anything further to report on that today. I hope to have a more concrete story for our next meeting, but just a spoiler, so to speak. In closing, I'd like to say that we in the Department of Computer Science at UW are strong supporters of blockchain technology, and we will continue to be strong supporters in the future. UW is one of a growing number of universities that are investing in the blockchain space. My view is that the field is rapidly maturing and becoming increasingly relevant. Before too long, all universities will be doing something with blockchain. Wyoming is already there. Again, thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Professor Gamboa. I'll start with a question about the colleges. We obviously have in the budget footnote a need to ensure that we're building out in a way that provides partnerships and opportunities with our colleges. I know that that's already underway, and I wanted to hear a little bit about what's going on with engagement between the university and the colleges on coursework and programming related to blockchain.
Engagement between the university and the college. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so we are very heavily engaged right now in related to software engineering, which is kind of like it's not exactly blockchain, right? So it doesn't directly answer your question, but it is related in the sense of what I spoke earlier, which is that blockchain is a fairly advanced piece of technology. Primarily because even though it's programming, when you're building a smart contract, you're automatically dealing with distributed programming. There's lots of computers where this could be happening in, and also with the issue of immutability, and everything that gets done stays in the blockchain and stays in the blockchain. I mean, it never ever comes out or is modified. That has consequences, for example, for mistakes. Right? If anybody makes a mistake in a piece of code, well, it's not as easy as sending a new patch overnight the way Microsoft might do. It's actually a major undertaking. So it isn't the kind of thing that you just jump into. So for blockchain and the colleges, I believe that it'll be probably, taking some preliminary steps in the colleges, probably related to just general programming, the way that the software engineering program is doing, and then specializing on more blockchain specific topics. At least the first year needs to be that way, possibly even the first two. I mean, that's an open question. I have seen bootcamp smart contract programming projects, but they're designed for either advanced undergraduate students in computer science or professionals in the field.
Gotcha. Thanks. Go ahead, Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Professor Gamboa, if the state put money into creating a new school of computing, how would that change or be different from what you're doing now? And would that be a good thing?
Go ahead, Professor Gamboa.
So I have to be careful because I need to put a context on the word "you," right? How will it be different in what I'm doing or even my department's doing? A lot of the same things will happen. I mean, it might be in a different house, right? But a lot of the same activities are going to take place. I think the real benefit to something like a school of computing is in the interdisciplinary work, because computing is something that affects everybody on campus and off it. I mean, here I am, testifying before this committee several hundred miles away, right? That's all computing, right? I mean, that's so we're affected, all of us, and sometimes departments are silo oriented, right? And having something like the School of Computing, and I think is one of its primary goals, encourages greater interdisciplinary projects. That might have some effects directly in blockchain. I mean, everything we've heard about today, for example, crosses boundaries, from the law school to the ag school to, School of Energy Resources and so on, right? We have, that's part of the DNA in this space. And I hope that we're going to see a lot of more of that in the future, because, as a pure technologist, as a computer scientist, I can tell you that the greatest day of my life, absolutely, was the day that I visited a skyscraper in New York, and I saw some people making $1 million decisions on using my software. And up to that point, you never actually connected. It was like, oh, I write code, but actually seeing that code had an impact, right? Was life changing for me. And I confess that my first reaction was, oh my God, I hope I don't have a bug. But it turns out that I did have bugs, and we worked them through and worked with the clients, and everything was wonderful. And quite honestly, having applications, right, for what we do is what gives it meaning. So I dying to see those interdisciplinary opportunities kind of happen.
Excellent. Follow-up?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. Any other questions? Questions for Professor Gamboa? Seeing none, thank you, Professor Gamboa. Appreciate you virtually being here, and sorry you can't be here in person. I understand how those challenges come up, and if you have to grade, you have to grade. All right. With that, any further questions before we go to public comment? Further questions or comments? Seeing none, let's invite Mr. Allen to join us then.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Allen, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see you again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and select blockchain committee members for inviting me to participate in several sessions today. My name is Christopher Allen. I'm the founder of Blockchain Commons, a blockchain infrastructure development and research organization. But I wanted to speak during this section specifically about blockchain education. As a former professor and also the author of the very popular Learning Bitcoin on the Command Line course that has educated a lot of people about how to join in the Bitcoin side of the blockchain industry. I have great desire to see more happen in the area of education of blockchains. So I had 2 points. I'll keep it brief because I know people want to get on to the next agenda items. One is, it's been in passing several previous member testimony has mentioned the disparate skills that are required. In order to be a Satoshi, you need to not only have cryptography and software engineering and engineering psychology, game theory, incentive design, mechanism design, economics, business, law, and probably a lot of other different types of things. To be able to properly design these types of things is a multidisciplinary learning. And other schools that are looking at multidisciplinary learning have created groups that bring in people from many, many different departments. I think most notably the D School at Stanford. So I would really like to see more than this all be an IT type function. I might want to see more minors and things of that nature. Minor courses, not crypto minors. I'd like to see more minor courses, but I think it needs to be more integrated than that. I could almost see a student spending a whole year of 3-4 courses a quarter that are all integrated together in some way to teach all the different things that you need to be able to be a fully rounded person in this community. So I encourage getting funding for that type of work and considering a much broader initiative than from a single part of the university. Secondly, I would really like to see what University of Wyoming do more in the area of open courseware. My Learning Bitcoin from the Command Line is open courseware, and last year's summer interns actually at the end of their internship updated the course because this technology evolves and helped make that available. I think Stanford has done an amazing job with making some of their courseware open. And I think that attracts students and other parties, professors, et cetera. Right now, if you want to learn about some of the core cryptography of how all this type of stuff works, unfortunately, you pretty much got to go to Stanford and, but fortunately, they make their Stanford cryptography course that Dan Bonet does every year as open courseware. And, so tens of thousands of people can potentially participate. So that's another thing I would like to encourage University of Wyoming to do. It will help, raise your name in the community, but also bring students ultimately to your institution. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. Questions for Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen, thanks once again for all of the hard work that you've put into these efforts and helping us to build everything that we've built once again this year. And I appreciate the fact that you're joining us again. I wish you could have been here in Jackson in person as well. But hopefully we'll see you in Laramie in September.
Yes, September is already on the books.
Excellent. All right. Any further questions, discussion? All right. Thank you. Clarissa, do we have any further public testimony at this time?
Mr. Chairman, that's all I have for public comment for this item.
Excellent. All right. Public comment in the room. Does anyone want to provide any public testimony? Anything on the University of Wyoming's programs? No. All right. Going once, going twice. Thank you. Public testimony is closed. Committee, any comments before we take a little bit of a break? Well, excellent. All right. With that, we're a bit ahead of schedule, which is always good when we're trying to get out of town early. So let's come back in about 10 o'clock and take 15 minutes break. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Welcome back. The next item on the agenda is decentralized autonomous organizations and updates on the work there. We have a bill draft. We've got Mr. Kaufman and Mr. Wright, hopefully both available. Yep, I see them both. Excellent. The concept here is a bit of an overview is obviously we passed this decentralized autonomous organization legislation in the last legislative session. And while we were working it in the session and since, we've received a good bit of input and feedback, which we were expecting and thankful for on ways that we can improve it. So we already have a bill draft for consideration today to walk through and contemplate some of the changes and some of the ways that we can improve it. The Dow legislation was met with a tremendous amount, I think, of support and interest. So we're happy to have the feedback that we're getting. Welcome to good Representative Schwartz. Thanks for joining us this morning. Excellent. And we look forward to your comments on DAOs and digital identity here in a little bit. We can have you lead off if you'd like. We can put one in. We can do that. All right. So the way, Mr. Co-Chairman, if you think it works, is maybe get some very brief opening comments or thoughts from Mr. Kaufman and Wright if they have anything they want to start with. But I think walking through the legislation so we can begin to contemplate what the concerns are that we're addressing, and then having discussion about those concerns and any other concerns through public testimony, and then trying to move this bill forward. The one consideration we have, committee, is that there are some changes here that would be very good to get implemented as quickly as possible, and contemplating the possibility of a special session. This would be a bill that we might actually want to kick something out of committee if possible today, so that it's theoretically ready for a special session if one does happen. And then honestly, if it doesn't happen, that's just fine. We just go back to the drawing board and we keep working the bill, which I don't think will necessarily get into perfect shape today. But what do you think about that approach and the path forward on this, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Well, particularly, as far as the special session legislation goes, I think it's a good goal, and we'll see where we end up. But as for this discussion, I do think, based on kind of what unfolded yesterday, I think when we got into the insurance realm, I think it would be helpful to walk through the legislation first. Yeah. And then that way we all know what we're discussing as we're discussing it. So I think that'll keep us a little more pointed.
Excellent.
But
Sounds good.
Opening comments from
Yep.
Mr. Kaufman would be appreciated.
Mr. Kaufman, any opening comments before we walk through the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I would just direct the committee's attention and kind of remind everyone that obviously, again, this legislation was designed and is designed to be a supplement to Wyoming's LLC Act, not in any way, shape, or form a replacement or an amendment to the underlying LLC Act. And that was a really important feature that we discussed in last year's committees. And I think it's important to a lot of both the legal community, but the legislative community as well. And so with that context in mind, understand that a lot of these amendments that we're going to walk through in this bill were designed really for two purposes. One, to bring more harmony with respect to the underlying LLC Act, where we were concerned that the principles in the underlying LLC Act that supplement this might create some confusion. And then secondly, there were cleanups that were just designed to be more streamlined so that the language was a little bit more precise. There were a number of concerns raised by people as we went through this process. And just frankly, we ran out of time during the legislative process to get some of these tweaks made. And so a lot of this was stuff that was worked through by a lot of people. We had comments from a lot of folks. We just didn't get it done. So I just wanted to provide that context.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. And Mr. Wright, anything before we get started and walk through the bill?
No, I think that was a great summary. I think as we walk through the bill, you'll see a lot of it is just incorporating feedback that folks provided and or is just cleanup of some of the language to provide more clarity and hopefully to make the bill stronger, or the approach
Excellent.
stronger.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Appreciate it. And Mr. Wright and Mr. Kaufman were instrumental on the the Dow Working Group. I see other members that have joined in. Mr. Marr, Mr. Allen, Mr. Greenwood, Mr. Hess have all been involved previously, and I think they've got some public comment today. I'll note before we get started, and when we're contemplating public comment, let's try and keep that very concise on this topic, because we are trying to stay on a relatively rapid timeline so that we can get everybody out of town and driving back home early in the day, and hopefully we'll be able to get out for lunch a little bit before noon if possible. So with that, Mr. Hopkinson, if you'll come over and walk us through the bill draft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson, Staff Attorney with the Legislative Service Office. I'll be reviewing informal draft A 0.03. This bill draft is titled Decentralized Autonomous Organization Amendments. And some of that background provided, a lot of this is based on just feedback that had been received. As we work through this bill or walk through it, some of the primary things that it does, it removes the concept of quorum from the bill. So we'll see that being taken out. It removes the distinction that was made in the original bill about member managed versus algorithmically managed decentralized autonomous organizations. It was felt that that distinction didn't need to be there, that they're just decentralized autonomous organizations, and the level of the algorithmic management doesn't really play a role, that there shouldn't be that distinction. It does some cleanup, and then there's a few other provisions that we'll see as we walk through. Looking on page 2, we'll start there. It makes amendments to the definition section in 1731-102. The first one there, paragraph 5, majority of the members. And you'll see that it's again towards the middle of that paragraph, it is removing that language about requiring a quorum, and instead defining majority of the members as more than 50% of the membership interests eligible to participate in a vote, or any number of membership interests required in a decentralized autonomous organization's articles of organization or operating agreement. Paragraph 6 makes some amendments to the membership interest definition. We see on line 21, it changes share to right, removes the member managed language that I previously talked about, and then provides essentially that membership interest is a member's ownership right in a decentralized autonomous organization, which may be determined by the organization's articles of organization or operating agreement. And on page 3, we see new language there that provides that it may also be ascertainable from a blockchain on which the organization relies to determine membership ownership right. Next change we see is in paragraph 9, a smart contract. And this adds this concept of that the smart contract could be relying on a blockchain on line 12. On page 3, or excuse me, going to page 4, first change there on line 3 is simply some grammatical cleanup. We see more on lines 10 through 19, making some changes in 1731-104. Again, primarily getting rid of member managed, this distinction between member versus algorithmically managed. And it also, there's a bit of a policy shift here with respect to requiring that a statement in the articles of organization, we change it from may define on line 10 and 11 to shall establish how the decentralized autonomous organization shall be managed by the members. So it makes that requirement that the articles of organization have to establish how that's going to be done. And including to what extent that management will be conducted algorithmically. You see that new language on lines 18 and 19. On page 5, the amendment we see at the top here under subsection D is primarily clarifying and provides that to the extent the decentralized autonomous organization to be organized under this chapter is entirely or intends to be entirely algorithmically managed, then it shall only form if the underlying smart contracts are able to be updated, modified, or otherwise upgraded. So it provides that mandatory requirement that if they are going to be entirely algorithmically managed, the smart contracts shall have that ability to be updated. Further down on that page, we see some changes to paragraph 10 under the Articles of Organization section. And this is providing that the Articles of Organization and smart contracts. On 10, we see some clarifying language, the procedures for modifying or otherwise revising the organization's smart contracts. Those are something that the Articles of Organization and smart contracts shall govern the following things. And that's what we're looking at here. And we've added a new paragraph 11, providing that the Articles of Organization smart contracts will govern dispute resolution. And then just renumbering paragraph 11 as paragraph 12. On page 6, under section 1731-108 operating agreement, this is just adding some additional language there, providing that if the Articles of Organization or a smart contract do not otherwise provide for a matter described in the Articles of Organization, the obligations, rights, and duties of the members and operation of the decentralized autonomous organization may be supplemented by an operating agreement. On the next few lines there, lines 11 through 15 under management, 1731-109. The change here is again primarily just getting rid of the distinction member managed, and it provides the new language that management of the decentralized autonomous organization shall be vested in its members or the members in any applicable smart contracts if algorithmically managed. Moving on to page 7, amending 1731-111, the membership interests for decentralized autonomous organizations and for voting. And I'm just making a personal note here that we need to change that member managed from the title there. But paragraph 1, A1, again, just removing some language about the member managed, making some cleanup there. And then in paragraph 2, providing that if all members have not contributed, then that voting requirement would be that each member or have not contributed a digital asset, then the voting would be essentially 1 vote per member. Further down, 1731-112 towards the bottom of page 7. This amendment adds dissociated members to those who, in addition to members, and it's essentially clarifying language, clarifying that if information is available on the blockchain, then members and dissociated members aren't entitled to separately inspect or copy those records where that information is available. On page 8, under 1731-113, that's simply on line 7, just some cleanup. On lines 15 and 16, again, taking out the member managed. And on lines 20 and 21, this is a bit of a change. This section is dealing with the dissolution of the decentralized autonomous organization and provides that under paragraph 5 that the Secretary of State could order the decentralized autonomous organization to be dissolved if it's no longer performing the lawful purpose and the new language, or if it's no longer under the control of at least 1 member. So if a person isn't actually controlling the organization, then it would be dissolved. And on page 9, there's a new paragraph 6 where the organization would be dissolved, where all members of the decentralized autonomous organization have withdrawn. Section 2 is repealing some language from the statutes, and for your reference, that language is included in the staff comment. Essentially, it's repealing the definition for a limited liability autonomous organization, or LAO. It's repealing quorum, the term quorum, and the definition for that. And it's repealing a requirement that was previously found where a quorum would be required for voting purposes. And again, we're removing that quorum language and relying instead on the majority of the members definition. On page 10, the effective date, this act would be effective immediately. And with that, I would stand for any questions on the draft.
Excellent questions. Starting with you, Ms. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question about the removal of the language member managed. There will still always have to be a control person involved with one of these organizations. Do I understand that correctly?
Mr. Hopkinson, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, my understanding, at least of some of the feedback that was received, is there really didn't need to be this distinction that we see in the original bill between a member managed versus an algorithmically managed.
Okay.
All of them are going to be controlled by a member. The algorithm is never going to be entirely in charge of the organization.
Go ahead,
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up. Thank you. The reason I'm asking is because under the Bank Secrecy Act, there needs to be a control person involved with the entity in order for the entity to be able to get a bank account. Now, some of these DAOs will not care about the ability to get a bank account or a securities account, but I understand from Mr. Wright that some of the DAOs that are already registered and operating are existing Delaware LLCs. And the reason they've been able to get access to the financial system under the Bank Secrecy Act is because there's a control person. And that's where I want to make sure that these changes don't close that door. I just want to be sure I understand properly. If there's not a control person involved with one of these under Wyoming statute, it's automatically dissolved. Is that correct?
Go ahead, Mr. Hopkinson.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. If there's no longer somebody, a real person controlling the organization, it would be dissolved by the Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you.
Other questions? Go ahead, Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hopkinson, thank you. Right now, when you fill out the form to establish an LLC, for example, it's pretty simple. You fill out just a couple of blanks and you're done. You hit the button and it's pretty quick. This draft bill seems to contemplate articles of organization that are more robust. So on page 5, line 19, it says that the articles of organization shall govern dispute resolution. And my question, I guess, is what's the thought behind requiring that to be in the articles of organization? Because normally you don't necessarily need that just to form a company.
Mr. Hopkinson, if you want to answer that, otherwise we can get phone a friend on that one.
Mr. Chairman, that was frankly a question I had when making this draft. I would defer to Mr. Kaufman or Mr. Wright for the policy behind that.
Absolutely. Mr. Kaufman, you want to weigh in, or Mr. Wright? Go ahead, Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to weigh in. So this draft doesn't necessarily completely reflect, obviously, the underlying language that the legislature passed, but 1731-106 sets forth what's going to be required in the articles of organization. And we do have in there some verbiage regarding relations among the members, between themselves and between the autonomous organization, people's rights, and kind of all of the other potential friction points. And so what this amendment is intended to do is that, again, we're creating a hierarchy that if the articles specify a particular dispute resolution mechanism, that's going to govern.
Go ahead and follow up.
Mr. Chairman, but this doesn't seem to say that. This says that you must declare a dispute resolution procedure, both in the articles and in your smart contracts, right? I mean, it doesn't, it's not optional here, right?
Mr. Kaufman, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. It was added to the list. Yes, I was just trying to specify that we're creating a hierarchy for that dispute resolution, but yes, that observation is correct.
And quick follow-up, if you refer back to the bill that we passed, the C paragraph that you see there obviously already has about 10 different things that are there that are not necessarily required to be, well, some of them are, explicit in the Articles of Organization. And the discussion here was the idea that even though we tried to model as closely after an LLC as possible, if you're going to be algorithmically managed and you're going to request liability protection in the state of Wyoming for an algorithmically managed entity, we chose to have more clarity. We chose to have more information and sophistication in what would have to be publicly exposed in exchange for having liability protection for an algorithm. And so it is beyond in many cases, and here is an additional aspect with dispute resolution, because dispute resolution specifically came up as, well, how do you handle that if it's algorithmically managed and you have a dispute with the algorithm? How do you handle that? That was the question that was raised, and it was a good concern. So the thought and the remedy was to put it here as a new provision under the C, which would indicate that you have to show something. You have to say something about how disputes will be resolved, either in your articles or in the smart contract, the sum thereof, to be sufficient to have algorithmic management in any capacity. That was the conversation. And again, I don't think any of us is saying that's perfect, but that's the thought behind it. And Mr. Wright, did you want to add anything to that briefly?
Yeah. I mean, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question. The intent, at least as I understand it, and possibly there should be a bit more clarifying language. It doesn't require that you articulate dispute resolution. It says it shall govern. It's creating a hierarchy between the articles of organization and the smart contracts, as Mr. Kaufman noted. But I guess that raises a question: should it be required, or should the language possibly be further clarified there? But I think the intent, at least the intent of some folks that were drafting, was just trying to establish this hierarchy. So the articles of organization and the smart contracts for a DAO shall govern all the following. I don't know if it necessarily means you need to articulate the dispute resolution provision, at least in my reading. So maybe there's a little ambiguity there.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Anything else on that point? Go ahead. Representative Stithen, follow up.
No, Mr. Chairman, I'll just think about that. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, any other questions at this time? Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
And I guess this question can be for anyone. I think it's probably more of a policy question. It's not a big deal. I'm just curious. So under membership interest, we're defining a membership interest as a member's ownership right. Interestingly enough, we don't have a definition in the existing LLC statutes of a membership interest. We define a member. We don't define a membership interest. We do here because we use it throughout the new statute. I get that, but I'm just curious what the thoughts are on why we're using right versus share. And the only other place I find it in our statute is under the public trust companies law, where we do fun thing we do when we make law, when we say, and we reuse the words inside the definition, but we chose not to reuse the definition itself here. What's the thought process?
Mr. Hopkinson, any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, I would defer on that question to Mr. Kaufman or Mr. Wright.
Sure. Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. So I think the theory here was a couple things. One, you're correct. The underlying LLC Act doesn't specify that term specifically, but what it does do throughout the act is create a definition of what that membership interest entails, and that it's both the economic rights, the rights to share in distributions, and the non-economic rights, the rights to participate in the vote. What we did here was attempt to simplify that for purposes of this DAO and indicate that your membership interest, which becomes important in calculating what your share of the ownership is that right that is specified. The reason that term, I think, was a little broader in this context is because we felt it might be a little harder to tie that definition specifically to what the underlying LLC Act refers to as either a distributable share or a participating voting control right. So this is intended to be a little bit more vague on purpose so that it can encompass both uses.
Go ahead and follow up if you.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, I wasn't here when we did this, but maybe they wrestled with the same issue when we wrote the cooperative marketing associations, because they, in the definition of a membership interest there, we specifically say it means a member's interest in both the financial rights, right to assign rights, the governance rights. So maybe wrestling with the same thing. And so to that point, do you feel like saying simply right, that's all encompassing to include what your list of rights, or is it necessary to say that's both your voting, governance, power, and financial rights, like they did in this cooperative marketing associations under Chapter 10?
Mr. Kaufman, thoughts?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would open that up for others' input as well. I don't think that would be a bad improvement at all. I think we'd want to keep that language again open a little bit, because I think, again, part of the excitement of this entity is we're not quite sure how people are going to use this yet. And so I'm a little reluctant to too tightly define those rights in exactly the same way that the underlying LLC Act is. But as long as we're not being inconsistent with the underlying LLC Act, I'm all for expanding on that.
Excellent. Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Hopkinson, directing your attention to page 2, lines 10 through 18, which defines majority of the members. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. We're now defining a majority of the members to mean more than 50% of the membership interest eligible to participate in a vote, or any number of membership interests required in the decentralized autonomous organization's articles of organization or operating agreement. So does that mean hypothetically you could have a decentralized autonomous organization with 1,000 members, but the articles of organization say that only 3 of them get to vote? I mean, that's how I read this, which is fine. I just want to, is that what it says?
Mr. Hopkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea behind this change, I think that what the effort to get at is allowing the organization to establish, if it needs to, a lesser percentage for a majority, simply because often you may not have a significant amount of participation. And so that's the reason, at least for the new language there, that we see that number can be changed in the organization's articles, organization or operating agreement. As far as your question, would it also allow them to establish a different number of people who are eligible to participate to vote? I suppose that could be established in their articles of organization as well.
Go ahead and follow up.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. Kind of responding to Representative Stith's questions and also Chairman Olson's. I think the struggle here is in recognizing that it is as flexible as the members want it to be, right? And so the importance of drafting those articles of organization, operating agreement are fundamental. Certainly is going to result in litigation, because what we know about people who get excited about forming these types of entities is that they don't navigate all of the potential outcomes. And that's, lawyers are aware of that. So when somebody comes in and wants to form an entity and you talk about the operating agreement, like, well, what should I do? And the conversation is, well, what do you want to do? And the overwhelming amount of flexible options is sometimes difficult to understand and difficult to know what to do. And so when we're putting something in statute, I think as Mr. Kaufman indicated, we want to keep it as open and flexible as possible, particularly right now on the front end of this new entity. And we can come back in years to come to understand where, problems might arise on a broad basis where it would require a statutory fix. But right now, the discomfort in the specificity is necessary to provide the greatest amount of flexibility to those members and how they want that entity to operate, what their rights are, and what that means would be defined by the operating agreement.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Senator. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman. Wait, anything else on that before we move on to another question? Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, different.
Okay, go ahead.
Different question, Mr. Co-Chairman. Can a smart contract exist somewhere other than a blockchain on another form of ledger? Right? Mm-hmm. It can, because it's just a code. So I'm just curious on page 3 if this could be or should be broadened, where we bring in blockchain specifically. Smart contract means an automated transaction, et cetera. I guess it's an or. So we're not excluding our definition of smart contract to a code that only exists on a blockchain.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, and
Go ahead. Yep.
Mr. Wright can weigh in here, but we did wrestle with that language a lot, and you tell us if you're reading it differently, but we were reading that as, smart contract as defined, or a substantially similar analog or code, or a script or programming language relying on a blockchain. So we were trying to be inclusive there in that list, but if you all are not reading it that way, it's good to know.
No, I think you're there. I just started midway through the definition and skipped over all the first stuff that wasn't in blue or red. So I got the oars now. Thank you.
Aaron, feel free to weigh in if you think I messed that up.
No, I think that was the intent, was to make it as broad as possible. And that was some feedback that folks that were looking at the bill noted, that the initial definition was a bit too narrow and wouldn't capture today and possibly even into the future some of the potential use cases of a smart contract. And thematically, I just say what actually is a smart contract becomes a deep and knotty question. So we probably make sense to keep it as broad as possible to account for changes in the ecosystem and development.
On that point, Mr. Wright, and to co-chairman's question, why not strike the words relying on a blockchain? Why do we need those? Mr. Wright, any thoughts on that? Would that do damage? Would that help?
I think the use of the term smart contract, particularly for developers, has a connotation of it currently relying on a blockchain. So that would be an argument for keeping it in. If though folks wanted to broaden it further, I'd have to think a little bit more about that, but that could possibly work.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman, it probably, I don't know that it does harm. I suppose maybe I think maybe the only good that comes from leaving the word blockchain in is SEO. When someone wants to search blockchain in Wyoming, then they may stumble upon our DAO law. But otherwise, if I guess I'm confused, because if the automated transaction as defined by our statute cited there, any substantial similar analog isn't enough, or code, script, or programming language isn't enough to broadly define it. I don't know I guess I just don't see what the benefit of saying relying on a blockchain is other than SEO. Because blockchain doesn't appear anywhere else in this, or does it appear somewhere else in the bill?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. It doesn't it does in the statute, whether it does in this bill or not. I'm not sure, but it definitely does in statute. The previous
It's
bill.
it's included in the definition of membership interest blockchain. And I think in several other spots.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on this topic? We can talk about it again later and get some feedback. Go ahead, Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at page 2, line 21, where we strike the word share and put in right. I guess this is a broad question for anybody, perhaps Mr. Wright or Mr. Kaufman. Striking share kind of makes me nervous, and maybe I'm looking at this too literally, because the difference between right, which means you have a right to something or a right to an action, versus share, which confers property and ownership of that property. Am I being too literal in reading into this, or what was the kind of the reason for striking that?
Mr. Wright.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in part, the concern was what people think about when they think of the word share. It tends to imply a security. I think that there's open questions as to what the interests in a DAO are, whether they would be securities or non-securities. So that was one concern. And I do think the second concern would just be characterizing ownership rights in LLCs, often are referred to as interests. So just kind of aligning that language here too. So that was at least my read. Mr. Kaufman, I don't know if you had any other thoughts there, but I think that those were the concerns that we were just trying to address.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just might add to that yes, Mr. Wright's exactly correct. The term share is often confused with corporate stock shares, and so we were trying to be very clear there. And the other issue is the underlying definitions in the LLC Act when they refer to transferable interests and membership interests, they refer to them as a right in the underlying LLC Act. So again, it was an attempt to be consistent.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Anything to follow up on that? No. Further questions at this time? All right, anything on any other topics as far as questions before we go to public comment? Seeing none. All right, thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. Let's go to public comment. And as I noted, let's try and focus on about 5 minutes maximum of public comment, and then we'll have a little Q&A and discussion. I know that everyone has some interest to express, and we want to get through all of them, but we do have limited time. So let's focus on concise statements. And with that, let's go to Mr. Greenwood. I see you up there. Welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Select Committee, and especially the people that helped to draft this legislation. I'm Daza Greenwood, and I wanted to make a couple of remarks about this bill and maybe a possible further tweak. The basic remark is, hey, this is a great bill and a great law. And one of the things to, I think, look at fixing came up earlier, which had to do with avoiding the result of having an algorithmically managed legal entity with no human control. And so in the potential fixes here, now there's language that indicates that dissolution shall occur by order of the Secretary of State if the DAO is deemed no longer to be under the control of at least one member. And I wanted to highlight that I think this is very positive language, but as I was thinking it through actually just now, I was thinking the definition of member, and tell me if this is different in Wyoming, but at least in Massachusetts, an LLC can be a member of an LLC. or any other legal entity can be a member. And so I wonder if the purpose to be served by this amended language would better be served by indicating at least one human member, or you could use the word natural person, assuming that that's what we're getting at. And in terms of not knowing how people would use the law, I can say I like this kind of law. I like to prototype things that would be automated and autonomous legal entities. And one of the first things I would probably try is creating 2 or more of them, and then having one algorithmically managed LLC be a member of another, and vice versa, and maybe starting with 1 or 2, or more human members, but then rotating the humans out to get to just explore and experiment with what happens when they're completely algorithmically owned and managed and there's no humans in town. That is probably the wrong policy approach and legal approach at this point, because LLCs are empowered to do any legal act. They're a legal person. They could, hire people, do any contract, engage in any lawful transaction, including high value, high risk, mission critical, high impact on society things. And AI just isn't at the point now where it can be trusted to make those kinds of judgments. I think we do assume that people for accountability is important. There's a big thrust now in AI safety research and making sure that when AI is applied in certain high impact potential ways, that there's humans in the loop. In Europe now, they're actually upgrading that to human in command. I think the language here is fine. In control, I think kind of gets at it. What's missing is potentially the human part. And I do believe that is the intent of this amendment. And so I would suggest this amendment is good. Sooner it's enacted, the better. And please consider adding the word human or natural person to modify the kind of member that must be present. The only other thing I'd say is it was mentioned earlier that dissolution would be automatic in the event of no member in control. But my reading of this is it would be by order of the Secretary of State, which would require an action, which I suppose the Secretary of State may or may not take. I don't see a requirement here that the Secretary of State make such an order. And it's hard to know practically how the Secretary of State would become aware when there's no human in control. So I think there may be some more details to work out, but probably better to not over-regulate this. So the only suggestion I'm making now actively is let's put human in, please. Thank you very much. That concludes my remarks.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Appreciate it. Questions for Mr. Greenwood? Any questions? Go ahead, Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenwood, you said you kind of wanted that human component in there. What kind of specific language would you suggest? I'm assuming somewhere on page 2 there, or what are your thoughts?
Go ahead, Mr. Greenwood.
Thank you for the question. I would suggest, and this is very much subject to what Aaron and Matt think, who are the more aware of the nuances of the language, but I think literally adding the single word human before member would do it, so that altogether the language would read, by order of the Secretary of State, if the decentralized autonomous organization is deemed, to no longer perform a lawful purpose, or is no longer under the control of at least one human, add human, then member. The other way is to use the phrase natural person, but then you have to change even more words to make it parse grammatically. So I'd be in favor of just adding the single word human after the number 1 and before the word member. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Follow up, Representative? I think the alternative there that Mr. Greenwood outlined could be, or is no longer under the control of at least one member that is a natural person, as a means of accomplishing that alternative. Any further questions for Mr. Greenwood?
Since you asked, Senator.
Go ahead, Mr. Greenwood.
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is exactly the alternative I had in mind. And the reason I didn't necessarily favor it is because it's just more words, and more words are usually bad.
More green book, more trees. Anything further? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Appreciate it. Stick around in case we have some questions on that. Appreciate it. All right. Moving next to, I see Mr. Allen up there. Let's go to Mr. Allen. Again, Mr. Allen, let's try and keep to about 5 minutes of comments on these. We've got, I think, 5 more people to go.
Yeah. So on Christopher Allen, Blockchain Commons, blockchain infrastructure and technologists. I've been involved with this community for 4+ years, in particular in the area of blockchain and identity technology. And I really appreciate the Select Blockchain committee letting me participate in this last year in a number of these subcommittees, including this one. I myself have 2 Wyoming corporations now, and doing a number of different functions using Wyoming law. And so I am both a user and a technologist advisor on this type of stuff, but I'm not a lawyer. I wanted to speak to a couple of different things. The discussion about blockchain a minute ago, I would refer the legislative aids to the New Hampshire blockchain law, which basically says blockchain means a mathematically secured, chronological, and decentralized consensus ledger or database, whether maintained by internet interaction, peer-to-peer network, or otherwise. Still my favorite legal definition of what is a blockchain, and just allows for a lot of different choices in addition to the obvious ones of Ethereum and Bitcoin and things of that nature. So that's in New Hampshire records law. Specific to this last discussion with DAZA, we have a new identity law, which begins to establish this idea behind a principal authority. I don't actually have a problem with a single member DAO that is technically an LLC, as long as we can somehow get to a human who has principal authority. So maybe we can't do that for this round, but as we begin to integrate the other laws that we're creating, the concept of a principal authority being a human is probably going to come up in other places. So that would be good. Specifically to this law, I appreciate the new changes. I think it's really important that DAOs are not locked into a single vendor or technology stack or even a business model. And I think I support these amendments. I think they address a number of concerns that I had with the last one. Do suspect we may have more tweaks to do as we actually start implementing these. But it's going to allow us to do a lot of different corporate voting techniques, governance techniques, our equity participation techniques, which aren't necessarily one-to-one or might leverage new ideas like quadratic voting. We need to be able to have that kind of flexibility in our DAO designs. Sort of at a larger level, we really need integration of DAOs with the series corporations and possibly the L3C low profit limited liability corporations available under Wyoming law. How do we make those work a little bit together? In particular, series corporations have gotten to be really annoying. I have one, has 7 sub-entities. Every financial institution that I deal with gives me hell because you can't rename the sub-companies. They have to be the primary, comma, series 1, series 2, series 3, et cetera. And they just don't understand that. They get confused. They may all be different legal entities, but they're always messing it up. And I definitely think a number of the DAO ideas that people want to do is more of a series corporation where different members will have different shares of different equity rights of the series. So we need to do that. And then finally, my biggest concern is there's just been this really long delay on the digital corporate registration system. I mean, this law was passed 4 years ago. And then has gotten more funding and some follow-up since that time. We should have been by now able to offer a DID-based verifiable claim that basically says the corporation exists and has a proof of good standing. We really need these for DAOs and smart contracts. And 2 years ago, I showed an actual working demo supported by multiple companies and Homeland Security for this particular functionality with Wyoming-style registered agents and corporations. A year ago, some students at a Wyoming hackathon did in a week a version that was maybe less capable, but basically worked with, could serve what the purpose was for Department of State. We still do not have that available. And a lot of these things, concerns of, the ability of the Department of State to trigger something such that, a company goes into a warning state or, needs to be dissolved as a smart contract. Well, we need those oracles from the Department of State. There are also a bunch of other services, beyond what has been already statutory, presented that you need to start doing in order to keep up, including registering digital assets so that they can fall officially under Wyoming law. We've already talked about the opportunities for money to do the loan registrations, lots of digital oracles and things of that nature. So please, please, please find some way in this session to get that going. It's going to limit the rest of you. I can go to Estonia right now using my Estonian EID, and I can get an Estonian corporation, a bank account and merchant banking account and all that type of stuff in about 24 hours. You've got to compete with that. So I'll leave it there. I have more detail on all of that if people are interested in, but I wanted to try to keep it as short as I could. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Allen. I appreciate it. Questions for Mr. Allen? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Allen, thank you so much. And I don't want to take up too much time here, but what you've just identified as the gaps in the functions performed currently by the Wyoming Secretary of State, would you mind putting that into an email and maybe emailing it to the chairman or somebody? I just having trouble unpacking it and don't want to make you spend a half an hour trying to explain it to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I will say my testimony at last year, which is on the public record, is basically the same. I made the same concern last year. And that is written testimony from the first session of last year's select committee. But yeah, I can send another letter.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Allen. And yeah, we could talk a little bit more offline about that as well, because it's been a challenge for us for, I think Mr. Allen said 5 years, and it's probably accurate in terms of an objective we've had that we haven't been able to accomplish that enables all these other technologies to come together. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman. All right, I'll take it from here.
I'm not meant to speak. Yeah, no, to that last point for Representative Stith, we've committee sent out several bills on that. It's just there's some other things that happen in the sausage making process that doesn't allow for those bills to move forward and create that fruition that we have long desired. Mr. Allen, I was just going to let you know that on your Estonia point, on our next meeting in Laramie, we actually will be discussing e-residency. It's going to be one of the topic. It's a topic item for the interim. So we're going to kick that around and see what we can do with it. So of course you'll be there, but definitely invite you to help us with that conversation when we get there.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Any further questions for Mr. Allen? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Allen. We will definitely be in touch as we try and work this. Appreciate it. All right. I see Mr. Henning Diedrich up there. Let's go to Henning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Henning Dietrich. I'm the founder of Lexon Digital. We're creating human readable language for smart contract. So I've been consulting for the European Union, for Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund on blockchain. And I would like to add just one short comment to the discussion about human control. I think if that is not already given, it's important to keep it nested. So there is kind of the final control, or the ultimate control should be with a human maybe, but not maybe individually, immediately just on the first level. The other comment I would have is if we're talking about blockchain as a queue, then I think it's important to keep in mind that the kind of unstoppable nature is what makes smart contracts running on a blockchain different from just any kind of algorithm that helps automating the business of a company, which of course could be coded, could of course be called a smart contract, but it is potentially not quite the same. And I think a lot of the excitement about this law and is about making this kind of unstoppable algorithmic a reality. Otherwise, congratulations. I think it's super exciting stuff that's happening here. And that's my comment so far.
Thank you, Henning. Thanks for joining us today. What time is it there, Henning?
It's only 7 p.m.
Oh, that's not bad. All right. Any questions for Henning? Any questions? So Henning, did you have a remedy on the thought that you had with regard to, it sounded like you were interested in us maintaining the blockchain language, but we wanted to maintain the flexibility in that definition. Any thoughts on a remedy there that threads that needle?
No, not off the bat. I mean, it's like we're using it there. I mean, as I said, it's almost like a queue. Queue blockchain, right? It is what the intent is. It defines the spirit of the law in a certain sense more than that it is boxing in what it should exactly be. And I would like to add that outside of our bubble, smart contract is still being used for off-chain contracts that are just managed in a smarter way. There are papers being written using the word that way in computational law. So we have to be mindful that, yes, it's absolutely true. Also, this is a big business to try to just manage millions of contracts better, and that's called smart contracts. But just the automation of business is probably not what we're talking about when we talk about this law here.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Anything further for Henning? Thanks, Henning. Appreciate all of the work that you've done in all of these efforts as well, and joining in the task forces, or excuse me, the working groups with us and helping us draft this legislation. So we'll certainly keep you involved at all times as well. Appreciate it. Brendan, Mr. Mayor, you are up. And Brendan, we're trying to keep to 5 minutes of comments today so that we can stay on schedule. So let's give us your top couple of highlights and look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Quickly, my name is Brendan Marr. I am a computer scientist and an MIT Media Laboratory alumnus. I am on the working group for the Digital Identity Acting Group, as well as the DAO, this DAO working group here. So I will get to the point, and I will forgo the test on staking pools and pledging, unfortunately, because I know everybody wants to go. Okay, so to the point. There is a few things of clarity that I can offer. So the first thing is regarding section, the section on, sorry, I lost my notes here. The section on membership interests. I think what is needed is more clarity on this idea of a governance token. The wording of the statute, I believe, which would give some clarity but leave flexibility, would be a governance token and or a voting token with no distribution rights shall not be a membership interest. And the reason being is that what we're seeing in the DAO communities is that, and I should say what we are fundamentally finding is that all of this that is happening now with DAOs and many of these technologies is a disambiguation and an inversion of how these things operate. So it's not just your traditional memberships that you have in the past, but you're segregating out voting from membership. You know, and we've been able to do this obviously with corporations and non-voting shares, but really getting to the heart of a voting governance token without distribution rights is not a membership interest, will allow for an explosion of participation and incentivization, the kind of thing that you would have 10 years out after an IPO in a traditional company, but have it right at this time. That's my first comment. My second comment goes along the lines of what was being discussed in the section on a smart contract. And there was a lot of things that were said to broaden that out and make it so that it is more generalized to other types of expressions of computational law. I would change the wording to include register transfer languages, assembly language, opcodes, protocols, source code, object code. All of these things get to what Christopher Allen was discussing at the meeting back in last December, which is that blockchains can operate without smart contracts. They can be coded where they have contractual logic, but not in the form of a smart contract as we know it. And this is what Rich Kavocha mentioned yesterday in the working group for NFTs. But I really want to hit home this idea that was brought up earlier by Christopher Allen. And it has to do with the fact that a lot of these things that we're seeing, a lot of these challenges that we're seeing, specifically all of the challenges around series LLCs, naming registered agents, verifying good standing of an entity, all of these things, as well as the most important aspects that have been raised here on this idea of contract stacking, basically an ordering and hierarchy of contracts, whether it be in articles of organizations or a smart contract or any computational logic. These ideas of ordering of legal documents or forms is really important, and they're generalized to all sorts of the things that we're seeing throughout all of these different things that we're struggling with digital identity, with DAOs, with everything. So really what we need to be looking towards, as I indicated yesterday, is that there are aspects to all of this that don't fit into these individual working groups that we're looking at, digital identity, et cetera. We really need something which is along the lines of a computational law act to take into account the big problems here, which is stacking of contracts. Where do you find things? Which blockchain are these things expressed on? Because when it comes to the Court of Chancery and being able to sort these things out, you're going to be able to need to find these things. And it also gets to the aspect that we left off last December regarding Christopher Allen's discussion and I getting to the point of these things also change. You have cryptographic keys, and those need to be rotated. You have names of things that change, roles of people that change. You have content, you have NFTs that point to things, and those things change. So being able to resolve not only where things are, but how they change and how they're named is all part of the same problem. And this is a generalized problem to all of these things we're discussing, which is why we can never make any headway, right? Because they are in the domain of computational law generally, rather than these specific acts that we're looking at. And we need changes, and we need the specific acts as well, of course, but they need to work hand in hand. That's all I have to say. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brendan. Appreciate it. And I think that I appreciate the email that you sent about us trying to kind of put together a working group on that. And I think we will need to take that approach to addressing some of these concerns and finding the way to integrate it. I did want, if you could repeat one more time the little bit of language in your first point about the governance token. I just want to make sure that I've got that language in front of me. And if you just read that back to me one more time, and we'll see if the committee has any questions. I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Something concrete we can act on right now. And that would be a governance token and or a voting token with no distribution rights shall not be a membership interest.
Shall not be. Okay, thank you. Committee, any questions for Mr. Marr? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman, completely off topic, but I think we need to find a way to bring in economic development and virtual reality into the blockchain task force, because I think Brendan would be phenomenal on virtual reality. I understand that to actually be one of his significant backgrounds, one of the first 100, I think, and 50 developers in VR. Little known fact about Brendan.
Absolutely. We do. We need to figure that out, how we link it, and we get Brendan involved in that. Excellent plan. Right.
Sure. Count me on the docket.
Thank you. Any further questions? All right. Seeing none, thank you so much. Appreciate your input as always, Brendan, and look forward to working with you more on the working groups. Thank you. I see Mr. Eric Hess. Let's bring him on.
Hello, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I'm a greenhorn here. This is my first one. I'm not on any working groups, but would definitely consider it because at heart, I'm a nerd for this stuff, and that has benefits sometimes. I have my own law firm. My background is heavily in the financial services space, senior legal roles at Lehman Brothers, at various technology providers, fintech providers, a CLO of a stock exchange. I represent digital asset exchanges, NFT providers. I worked heavily with the Bermuda Monetary Authority. But today, I commend you for the changes that you've made to the statute. I'm actually going to put my timer on so I don't go over 5 minutes. But basically, I had a few comments. I think some of them have been circulated around, but I think I'll start, feeding off of Daza's comment with regards to the petition, or I'm sorry, the order of the Secretary of State, and tying it to a human. I would add to that. I think there is some lack of clarity around what it takes for the Secretary of State to intervene. In a bankruptcy context, when things get out of control, bankruptcy is really about what happens when things go wrong, right? What's the break glass procedure when an organization isn't acting responsibly? In some ways, it could be very similar to an algorithm acting irresponsibly and potentially the participants having no power to stop it due to the limitations they've self-imposed in the formation process. I think simply providing that an interested party, or you could further restrict the definition of an interested party, but giving an interested party the ability to petition for that order of a Secretary of State effectively gives a break glass mechanism. Now, I raised on page 4, in 17-31-104, it talks about the establishment of that it's managed by members, including to what extent the management will be managed algorithmically. Essentially, that statement as to how it's going to be conducted algorithmically imposes certain limitations on management, which at a future point, if things don't go as they plan, because they don't always do, what do they do? And does that potentially create issues for them? Now, litigation is present in any corporation, but having the ability to petition the Secretary of State or some authority to basically facilitate putting an end to a DAO that the members have lost control of, I think would be a appropriate break glass mechanism and would establish some degree of control for that. That's my first comment. My second comment goes to the dispute resolution. I was one of the parties that was for putting that in the statute. And in addition, I also wanted to have a reference to software audit. In both cases, I think, there's obviously a concern about being, overbroad in regulation. You don't want to dictate so much more than an LLC to make the statute unappealing. But I think the right tone was struck in the conversation here today that you should address dispute resolution And I think there should be, they should address whether or not there's a third party or even just a software audit. They could simply say there is no software audit, there is no third party engaged for a software audit. But the question is how do all the participants know that the algorithm or the smart contract is doing what it is supposed to do? And again, I think simply having a statement that they address it would facilitate that. And I think that's really it. You know, those are my primary comments. I decided to keep it very simple.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Hess. Appreciate that. Questions for Mr. Hess? Any questions or thoughts from Mr. Hess? Go ahead, Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hess, I guess maybe it's not so much of a question, but I really appreciate your comment that there should be a petition process, because otherwise I think our current language is problematic, because it just says an order of the Secretary of State. And I think the Secretary of State has 100,000 or so companies to supervise theoretically, and doesn't come to work each day asking himself which ones might not be under the control of a human. So anyway, wouldn't you agree?
Thank you. Thoughts on that? Briefly, Mr. Hess?
I definitely agree. I mean, you know, again, things will not always go correctly. And how do you correct a sinking ship, particularly if it's, you know, under the control, everything's been sort of allocated to an algorithm.
Absolutely. Further discussion. Go ahead, Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, to Representative Stiff's question, I'm just spitballing here and wondering if this isn't the way that we get the Secretary of State's office to finally agree to update the registration IT system, because automating some of this part of it is going to be required. To Representative Stitt's point, they operate typical business hours, but a DAO is 24/7, 365. So there are many hours of many days where they wouldn't be there to immediately dissolve one of these organizations, and that there probably does need to be some automation. And perhaps this could actually be the breakthrough, maybe. Thank you.
Perhaps. Thank you, Ms. Long. Good point. Further discussion? Further discussion? Seeing none. Yep, go ahead. Who? I don't know who I'm hearing.
It was Matt Kaufman.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Matt. We've got enough people up top. I couldn't see it. Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to follow up with a question for Mr. Hess as well, because Mr. Hess, thank you for those comments. And even though you and I have never met, I've worked to incorporate a lot of your comments into what we're doing. So thank you. With respect to the petition idea, I really like that idea as well. My question is this: would you want to limit that petition right to existing members, or are you talking about leaving that petition right open to anyone?
So I don't think limiting it to existing members is going to be adequate. And the reason is that none of the existing members, you know, you could have a service provider in that role. You know, the existing members may not be engaged. So you know, I defined it broadly as interested parties, which kind of punts, but I think you could say existing members or a service provider or something to that effect, just because, you know, the operation of the smart contract or the software could have been outsourced, and that party may have all the knowledge or may have the greatest familiarity with the issues that are being experienced. And again, the Secretary of State has the ability to say, I mean, obviously, like in a bankruptcy petition, if you do an involuntary bankruptcy petition, obviously the party that the petition is made against has the ability to respond. So it's not as if it's something that's out of control. It's simply that there is a party that is aggrieved, or, you know, it's a member, or it's a service provider. The only danger with an aggrieved party is that could get overly broad and maybe annoying. So, but I would say service provider or existing members at the least, and then contemplate what goes beyond that.
Thank you, Mr. Hess. One problem, obviously, with the existing member is that, you know, one of the reasons for dissolution is going to be a lack of a responsive member. So you get yourself painted into a little bit of a corner on that one, and then you have to rely on outside entities. So it's probably a little more challenging than just relying on the membership, but very
Correct.
strong point. Follow up, Mr. Kaufman.
No, Mr. Chairman, I'll reiterate, I like that concept, and I think we can talk about it when we discuss further amendments, but I'm sure we can come up with something creative to address that.
Excellent. Mr. Allen, I see that you want to weigh in on this very briefly. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I think this all is this hierarchy that we were talking about in law. We're trying to reproduce this with algorithmic systems. And at the root of it is, a certificate of good standing from the state that is issued in a fashion such that it can be an oracle, which allows smart contracts and other parties to be able to rely on that to allow for things like dissolution or whatever. Similarly, there's a whole raft of other oracles and verifiable credentials that ought to be able to be offered by various parties. I would love to see a digital registered agent. And maybe digital registered agents can act not just for the company that they're with, they can act to petition, do one of these petitions or whatever, or have other things that they can do as well. I think there's a variety of different kinds of things, the e-residency, et cetera, that we need to do, which also leads to some money things. It's $50 to register a corporation in Wyoming. It's incredibly cheap compared to other places. If it was twice as expensive, it would still be cheap. So, is there an opportunity, especially with these ones that might be the first candidates for these digital oracles and these extra services, et cetera, to maybe be $100 a year or something of that nature, so that the funds can be specifically allocated toward being able to offer these state services. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Allen. Any follow-up questions, committee, on this topic? All right, seeing none, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Hess, for joining us for the first time, but we really do appreciate all the input you've given over the last year on this topic, and we hope you'll continue to participate and be a part of this this DAO group.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have anyone else that I haven't seen yet on the list, Clarissa?
Mr. Chairman, those are all the virtual folks I have for today. Professor Moxery from UW wasn't able to join us.
Okay.
And then I don't see Professor Hughes as well online. So.
All right, that's it virtually for today. Anyone here in real life have anything to say? Representative Schwartz, anything to say? Okay, please join us. Yep, come on up and have a seat at the hot seat. Introduce yourself, turn the green light on. Everyone in the world will be able to hear and interact.
Great, thanks so much. Diana Myers. I am new to this, so I don't know whether any consideration has been given to the federal income tax consequences of DAOs. I will say that the federal tax regs say that an entity that has one owner can elect to be taxed as either a disregarded entity or as an association. And so because owner is the key word in the federal tax regs, I wonder whether we need to integrate in any way. In other words, if the IRS is going to look at a DAO and they're going to say a DAO has 1 million owners, then there's no way that the DAO could be taxed as a disregarded entity for federal income tax purposes. That could make it less attractive.
Committee, go ahead, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, so Ms. Myers, if you have 1,000 owners or members who are owners, then that would just would that require then that the organization just issue K-1 statements to all 1,000 of them each year?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'd have two options in that scenario. You could either be taxed as a partnership, which means that many K-1s, or you could elect to be taxed as a corporation for federal income tax purposes, which means 2 layers of tax.
Follow?
Mr. Chairman, so theoretically, if you had 1,000 members, would it be possible then to incorporate as part of your smart contract that, by signing up and doing this, you're agreeing that if you actually make money on this venture, that we're going to issue you a K-1 statement, and that actually gets done somehow automatically by the algorithm?
Ms. Myers, go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, insofar as the algorithm is able to file the Form Text 1065 with the IRS, as well as all of the K-1s, that would be possible. You would need technological integration with the IRS's filing system, which I can assure you may not be as advanced as that of the DAOs.
Any further questions? So walk us through how this plays out with an existing LLC. We'll just say you've got 5 members of the LLC. What would their options be, and how would they have an ownership structure in place to take advantage of the tax law?
Well, in the current, if you're talking about a
Regular old school LLC.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Regular old school LLC typically is taxed as a partnership. So 5 owners, 5 K-1s, if you want a single level of tax. In the alternative, regular LLC is taxed as a corporation, pays 21% on all of the net profits inside the corporation, and then the shareholders pay tax on their dividends when they get dividends.
Is there a mechanism with a traditional LLC to employ this single owner concept, even though you had a variety of participants? If they were members, they would automatically have to either choose, this is my understanding, they would have to either choose from the partnership option or the corporation option, and they wouldn't have the ability to take advantage of this single owner concept that you've expressed. Is that fair?
Exactly right. So an entity with one owner for federal income tax purposes can be a disregarded entity under the federal tax law.
So what would you suggest if we wanted an opportunity, and I'm not sure how you would create this, but if you had a single member owner DAO to qualify as a disregarded entity, but had many other participants in the DAO, I guess the key would be under our definition of membership interest, there would only be one individual with a membership interest, even though there would be other individuals that had some sort of participation in it. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, the key word under 26 CFR 3017701 is owner. So I don't think it would help for our legislation to say that for federal income tax purposes, these guys aren't deemed to be owners.
I think they hate that, yeah.
However, insofar as our legislation doesn't use the word owner, that could help the case when the IRS looks at this and says, okay, what is this DAO and how is it going to be treated for US federal income tax purposes?
Excellent. Thanks. Go ahead, Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Myers, would you recommend then if we're creating a structure that provides for essentially an organization that may be run by an algorithm, that if we're making additional requirements in the articles of organization or operating agreement that we don't normally have for regular LLCs, would it be your recommendation that something about how the organization intends to be taxed be included in either the articles of organization, the operating agreement, or otherwise disclosed to the people who are signing up?
Ms. Myers, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, great question. I would certainly advise anyone who's setting one up to make a declaration about their intentions for federal income tax purposes. Whether that's controlling or not, to be determined.
Gotcha. Follow up. Any additional questions for Ms. Myers? This is something that we haven't talked about at any point. I don't recall a conversation on it. This is new. All right. Thank you so much. Anything else to add? Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Any further public comments? Further public comment? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Back to the committee for discussion. And we have a lot of ideas, I think, on the table. I think we can walk through some of the ideas and have a bit of discussion. I think it would be good for us to leave for lunch in about 13 minutes So a little bit of a quick discussion. And I think the best course of action, actually, based on the amount of feedback we have, is to iterate this bill and circulate it. And if we need to act ahead of the special session, if there is a special session, honestly, to do a half-day virtual meeting and act on it virtually as a virtual committee, and if we choose to. What do you think about that approach instead of having to work it right now for that possibility, Mr. Co-Chairman?
No, I think that's a good idea because obviously the reality of the special session looms as to whether it will.
Yeah, I think we're 50-50 at this point.
Yeah, I think so. So, and that way we don't, yeah, I think it's right that, we do want to have this as close to perfection as we can before July 1, as these start to fall out or come to fruition in Wyoming, and we start to see, I mean, they're already being formed right now, obviously, but when they're officially filed.
Right.
So I like that plan.
All right. Select Committee, let's take the next 10 minutes then. Is everyone amenable to that approach? I just want to see if there's any concerns about that approach. Seeing none. Raising this issue or the issues that we've heard, there are a few concepts. One is potentially strengthening the idea of human in command. We've got a couple of, or human in control, I guess is what it's called. We've got a couple of concepts there. Maybe let's start with that. Any strong feelings either way, anyway, on improving the human in control concept? We can have LSO work on it. We've heard some testimony, but concerns? Anyone opposed to the idea of adding some? Go ahead, Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, no, I think it's really important to clarify that to the extent that there needs to be, to the extent that any DAO ever wants to open a bank account or a securities account, it's got to be aligned with the Bank Secrecy Act compliance requirements. Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Go ahead, Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, so we have two issues going on in that same paragraph on page 8. One is the natural person issue, which I think is a good idea to add. But then we've also got the process of how it happens, right? Who's the interested party who can file a petition to say, hey, there's no human in control. Let's dissolve this thing. I don't have exact words to fix that. I think we do need a petition process. However, one part of our proposed bill says that the organization may be entirely controlled by an algorithm. And then we're going to have this section that say you must be controlled by a human. So it creates the potential, if interested party is broadly defined, it creates the potential for an unhappy service provider to threaten the organization by saying, I'm unhappy because you didn't pay me what I thought I was owed. I'm going to file a petition to get your charter revoked. And I don't think we want to avoid that kind of problem. So for example, by analogy to involuntary bankruptcy, one single creditor can't just push someone into bankruptcy. It takes at least 3, for example, typically, right? And there's some other requirements. You can't be, and the reason that you want to make a relatively high bar for that kind of involuntary bankruptcy is because you don't want unhappy creditors to just always be threatening to kill the company, right? So I don't have a perfect solution for that, but it's a problem.
No, good points. Additional discussion, Senator Nethercott, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And these are all great points regarding the human in control, which certainly makes sense. Also the tax selection pieces. But I wonder if circling back to the primary concern, which is the level of specificity we put into this, recognizing the flexibility associated with what these DAOs are. So that goes into, I know no one wants this, but consultation with the lawyer at the time of formation of the DAO, right? I know everyone, the whole idea was maybe to avoid that. And I told you no, but so, I really think that at the time of understanding, you go into the lawyer's office or whatever, you follow the software program that says, what kind of entity do you want to create? And it's a DAO. Why do you want to create a DAO? And then it can determine through a series of Q&A, whether it be a human asking the question or a screen that indicates whether or not you need to have a human owned in control, which would be required if you need a bank account, which would probably be the case most of the time, and those determinations can take place. It's my understanding, at the time of forming an entity, there's requirements with the IRS of when you can make an S election to get that pass through, whether or not you're going to be issuing the K1. So all of that just depends on the type of entity that you have. and what type of IRS elections you may make associated with the entity. And if you have to issue 1,000 K1s, then you got to issue 1,000 K1s. But it kind of just goes into the flexibility associated with the formation of the entity at the time. And are we going to write into this particular DAO bill entity all of those potential scenarios? Because we certainly don't do that with any other corporate entity under our corporate act. So just want to kind of bring it back a little bit. These are all very appropriate concerns, and I do think maybe touching on it in statute is important. But remember, there is a level of advice and tailoring that needs to take place that can't be encompassed the more specific we become. So
Yeah, no, good points. Additional discussion on that?
Mr. Chairman.
Let's see. Yes, Mr. Kaufman, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add on to that because I agree, and I agree with Representative Stith's comments as well, that I mean, first of all, when I go back to the bill that's passed in the dissolution section, we set forth a number of ways and reasons that the DAO might be dissolved. I still do like this idea of the petition so that there is some mechanism that initiates for the Secretary of State's office a reason to even look. Right now, it's specified as if the DAO fails to perform, a legal purpose. And so I'm envisioning some language I think that we could approach with that. But I also wanted to just state for the benefit of the group, I agree with what Senator Nethercott was just saying. I don't think we should be overly prescriptive in that. And I don't think we should inadvertently create, a sort of a backdoor remedy for people in this, because at the end of the day, there is still going to be a registered agent that is a natural person. And so the Secretary of State would have an opportunity or a way to notice that registered agent if there was proposed action taken, and you could dissolve the entity if they fail to, respond or comply. So I do still feel like there are some ways that these entities can be shut down if they're non-responsive. So I just wanted to provide that context for everybody. I'm still supportive, and I think we can find an easy way to work this petition language in, but without taking that too far.
Well, let's count that as a task then, basically. Let's try and find language for that and resolve this. It seems like there's general consensus here that everyone's comfortable with the idea, and we'll work on it. Go ahead, Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman, I think we could just direct LSO to provide just some language that a petition may be filed with by whomever. We probably need to make that decision to direct LSO to the Secretary of State with a time frame for the entity to respond, and then that's it, right? It doesn't need to be more detailed than that.
Right. Agreed. Everyone comfortable with that? And I don't know that we need to decide by whom yet, because I think that's an exploration
I was
point,
just going to
honestly.
say, David, just pick a random whoever and throw it in there, and then maybe we'll agree.
Yeah. And we can iterate over that also and kind of consult with this committee and others to try and figure out, as we contemplate it a bit more, what the right approach is there. But that sounds good. Any further conversation on this topic? All right. Seeing none, we've got that directive, and obviously I think we all agree on adding something about a natural person being in control is a key for the system. Going back through some of the other concerns raised briefly on page 2, there was some discussion about whether we're comfortable with the majority of the membership. I think we ended up resolved that language was fine. Does anyone have any concerns there? Okay. Page 3, the only real discussion we had was whether or not to delete relying on a blockchain in smart contract, and we actually kind of heard both sides of that. I think I'd probably leave it at this point in time, but what does everyone else feel? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, I'm okay leaving it, but I did have a question on that. I should have asked it at the time for Mr. Allen. So he brought up, and maybe LSO, you can just look at this, but I think he referenced the New Hampshire definition of blockchain. We defined blockchain in our statute.
Yeah.
So, long ago, and I actually feel like what I heard was what New Hampshire, what he cited, or was actually very similar to Wyoming. If not, it sounded like it. I wouldn't be surprised if it was our definition.
All right, let's take a look at that comparison then for next time and circulate.
I do think
New Hampshire versus ours.
Our definition of blockchain, I remember now that when we wrote it to not really be blockchain. We defined it as a distributive ledger, something like that.
Yeah, please do. I think there was a little more than in the New Hampshire definition.
But that's broad enough that it's not
Yeah.
technology specific, right? It's a ledger that's distributed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's bring those for comparison next time. We can take a look. Page 4, I think. What's that? No, I think we'll probably leave it. Yeah. For now, we can have more conversation on it. Page 4, I don't think there were any concerns expressed. Everyone was pretty comfortable with that language. Page 5. One question I had is at the top, this condition on D only occurs if it intends to be entirely algorithmically managed or is entirely algorithmically managed. And we've sort of moved away from that. I guess the question I have for consideration is lines 3 through 6 on page 5. The decentralized autonomous organization shall only form if the underlying smart contracts are able to be updated, modified, or otherwise upgraded. Wouldn't that be something that we would want to always be true, getting back to the human in control, that there would be no circumstance under which we wouldn't want it? We would want a DAO formed that the underlying smart contracts couldn't be updated, modified, or amended. Does everyone see what I'm getting at there? Seems like we would always want that from a human in control standpoint. Maybe we can consider that for next time. See what it would look like if we made it under all circumstances. The DAO is required to have that all the underlying smart contracts able to be updated, modified, or otherwise upgraded. I think that's an essential feature, particularly since you can cancel the DAO if it doesn't achieve that. Seems like you'd want that. All right. Next point was on page 5. There was discussion of dispute resolution and getting into this idea of whether the things under the C provision are required to be explicit, even if the explicit mention is we don't have one, which I guess could be there. And there is a little bit of ambiguity because it says the articles of organization, smart contracts for a decentralized autonomous organization shall govern all of the following. But I guess that doesn't necessitate that it be explicit, as I think Mr. Wright mentioned, that you have it. So in other words, if it's silent, is that governed or not? If there is no dispute resolution mentioned, is that still governed? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, so upon reflection, given that we're going to have this algorithmically controlled organization and disputes may arise, I suppose there's no harm in requiring the operating agreement or the articles to include a dispute resolution provision. The language is a bit awkward here because it says that the articles are governing dispute resolution, which implies that it really controls and overrides other, rules of civil procedure, for example, which it could not do.
Yeah, sure.
And that's a kind of a small technical point, but on balance, it doesn't give me much heartburn to include dispute resolution.
Yeah. What about the idea of the software audit committee? The idea that there be some sort of, this is not a formal full audit or anything like that. It's just the idea, I think, that Mr. Hess was talking about, that you've got the ability to point to the auditing of your code and the operation of your code. We can contemplate that and explore it for next time also. So Mr. Wright, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a really interesting point, and I appreciate the comment from Mr. Hess related to it. I just wanted to add a little bit more detail and color just about software audits as they stand today. Software audits generally cost software teams at least $50,000 to $100,000 to engage in them. And it's not clear that all DAOs will need a software audit. The beautiful thing about code, especially open source code, is that if it has been audited in the past, if other folks are using it, you may rely on other folks' work. So mandating or requiring that a software audit would be necessary would likely, A, be very expensive and cost prohibitive for most folks. It would be a huge hurdle. And B, it may not be necessary over time. So while I think it's an interesting concept and one that should be considered, I worry about those two facts.
Mm-hmm. I think Mr. Hess also suggested that it be stated whether you do one or what you do for one, but not necessarily that you're obligated to have one. What are your thoughts on that? I'm not saying we have to, but let's explore that.
Yeah, I think that what I would worry, I think that's an interesting concept too. What I would worry about there is if you're relying on code that was audited and has become fairly standard in the industry. Let's use as an example, the creation of a token. There's plenty of tokens that are created using a smart contract called the ERC20 token smart contract. That may have been audited in the past, may not have been. It may be difficult for folks to understand if they are relying on that, whether or not it has or has not been audited. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the underlying algorithmic systems are similar to that. And maybe it's discernible for a couple years, but if you zoom out 5, 10, 15 years, you may not be able to identify the audit, know where the audit occurred, et cetera. So I like the concept in spirit. I just worry about its cost and its, how well folks will be able to practically implement that over the long run, not in the short run, but over the long run.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the idea of a software audit for a DAO kind of feels analogous to requiring disclosure of whether or not we require a lawyer audit for an operating agreement for a regular LLC, which we don't do. So it just seems awkward that we would require it for a DAO specifically. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let's move on from that for now, unless there's any additional conversation. Okay. Page 6, there was some language that I know that David's going to clean up on member managed, but I did have a question for the committee on page 6, lines like 12 through 15 there. This reads a little bit awkwardly, where management of decentralized autonomous organizations shall be vested in its members or the members and any applicable smart contracts if algorithmically managed. To me, it seems like it's a lot cleaner to eliminate the first phrase, or the first members, so that it would be vested in its members and any applicable smart contracts, and then eliminate if algorithmically managed, because basically that implies to whatever extent it's algorithmically managed, then that's what the management is comprised of, the members and the algorithms. And I don't think you need that ambiguity. And I think it actually creates some lack of clarity. I can read that again. It would then just read, management of a decentralized autonomous organization shall be vested in its members and any applicable smart contracts.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I think by saying that the management is going to be vested in both the members and the smart contracts, you create potential conflict between the two. And if we've also got the flexibility elsewhere in the bill to say that you can be entirely algorithmically managed, which the bill does say elsewhere, then it would be in conflict with that other provision. And then we've also got the layer of just because you're a member doesn't mean you get to vote in our other section. So I think the current language, if awkward, is still at least consistent with the other parts of the bill.
The problem I have really is if algorithmically managed, because that implies a binary that, and we're trying to get away from that because there's a broad spectrum of algorithmically managed concepts that are allowable. So it's almost like it needs to say to the extent or where algorithmically managed. Maybe I'll just flag that for revision. David, will you, do you see what I'm getting at there in lines 13 and 14? The if algorithmically managed sounds like it's an or statement where it's more of a spectrum for the management. We can change that next revision. Okay. Anything else? I think we've gone through all of the discussion points that we had. Is there any other discussion point that anyone wants to bring up at this time ahead of lunch?
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Coppin.
I just one last final point, and I can circle back with LSO if you'd prefer, but in working through the bill over the recent weeks with Secretary of State's office, they did bring to my attention just a couple of minor structural numbering and cross-reference things that we wanted to circle back and clean up. So with your permission, I'm happy to loop LSO in on those and make sure we catch them.
Please do. All right, committee, anything else? With that, then let's break for lunch and let's get back here. I'll ask, we can do 1 o'clock or we can do 1:15. 1 o'clock is to get us out of town quicker. 1:15 is to give us more time. What?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
so regardless of what we say, we're perpetually
1 o'clock it
Late
is.
on
See
the
you all at 1.